I man, so I gotta wait till Tuesday. Okay. Oh my God. I just need to keep hearing that right there. Hey, you are awesomely awesome, and you're the best. You're the best. Bless. Just hell. I can't even. I don't even know what to say.
Had a vision for 20 in the morning, thinking of my little sister said morning. Struggling with realities, no maladies. Holidays ain't the same, everything's changed. No Bowie, no Prince, and no Michael, no Andre Crouch and the Disciples, no Walter and Winter, Derek Coley, no Whitney, no George Michael. Toys R Us gone bankrupt. Damn, the Guitar City went bankrupt. Everything from my childhood's missing, man. Man, I swear it's such a fucked up feeling, man. I'm the man, it's a simple observation. And I'm not sad, but it's not a celebration. I'm just trying to put the pieces back together, man. Everything's falling through my fingers like sand. It seems a tighter that I'm gripping. It seems the more that I am slipping. I feel like I lost everything I love. And where's this legend of God be love? And churches ain't the same. Gospel music just ain't the same. R&B it just ain't the same. But y'all keep telling me it's the same. But I ain't feeling nothing, damn it. And I don't wanna reach up and grab it. Shots fired, get to dunking. Always knew they were up to something. This ain't no future when you're frontin'. And y'all know you still out here fool. I'm not a baby, bro, I'm grown. Don't leave me standing out here alone. That's why I wrote this song. Because I know I'm not alone. What are we out here doing? What are we out here saying? People don't care no more. So forget I don't care no more. This is too much for you to handle. I was always too much to handle. There ain't nothing new about me. You don't want authenticity. You don't want sincerity. 2020 brought me clarity. Now I see who you really are. No mask wearing, mailbox wrecking, racist motherfucker. Let's go. Homie, you don't really want it. Sis, you don't really want it. I'm your nightmare opponent. Walking in a new anointing. Walking past all your bullets. Nothing in your trigger bullets. Try and pull it again. No weapon missed again. Tired of talking about changes. Tired of going through changes. Lie after lie. Lie after lie. Republicans and the Democrats. Prime ministers and bureaucrats. Senators and aristocrats. HBO and Cinemax. Film the babies in the cages. Babies dying in the cages. I ain't forgot about the cages. And if you did, then you're a racist. Calling it out like it is. Call it out like it is. We've been indoors for a year. And we're heading for another year. Lights off for cologne. High interest student loans. Living in a pandemic. Calculated and systemic. Start with black folks first. Kill that melanin first. Press us down and we pop up. Press us down and we pop back up. Speaking of getting it poppin', I heard you wanna get it poppin'. 400 years pent up. I guess you really wanna get pent up. We ain't playing with that ass. I'll get all up in that ass. Been doing wrong for too long. Time to sing a brand new song. Free at last. Free at last. Thank God Almighty. We're free at last. Free of all of your religion. All your European religion. All of your biased decisions. All of your wicked intentions. It didn't work back then. Ain't gonna work now. We were peaceful back then. But we get rowdy now. Let's get ready to rumble. Let's get ready to rumble. Sick of being here anyway. Can somebody shout change? Change! 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 team. Took a bullet for the dream that we would one day all be free. Free from prejudice, free from sexism, free from bigotry. I die for creativity. I die for freedom to be free. I died and left a legacy. Oh, but baby, I'm still live through technology. After the sun, then comes the rain. And after the storm, the sun will start shining. What is a pain? And tears of pain. And tears of pain. And a dash of struggle, just be patient. Your destiny will manifest. Yes, photosynthesis.
What is going on? What is going on? What is going on, everyone? Hello, hello, hello. Another day that we are here, girl. Again, another day. A step closer. To y'all getting what is known as revelations, girl. Some of us are laughing to keep from fucking crying and losing our minds, okay? Because, again, when you learn from history and you start seeing certain patterns, you have to be aware of those patterns. And one thing that we as queer people can prove beyond a reason or a shadow of a doubt is the fact that we understand how, at large, a lot of Americans, and to be honest and be more particular, a lot of Christian Americans feel about queer people. On this live this afternoon, what we're going to do is we're going to also listen, not just from my mouth, from my voice, from my words, understanding the words that come out of my mouth. We're not talking about just that. We're not going to listen to just that. We're going to listen to the testimonials of individuals who have survived the onslaught that we are getting ready to face. And this one that we're about to face is a little bit more darker than the ones they faced, because at this point they're telling us that they don't want to reconcile, they don't want to sit here and try to figure out how to change y'all, because they openly said that y'all can't change queer people's sexual attraction. So at this point, if you can't change, if you can't repent, if you can't try to find another alternative way, you will perish. Okay? So with that being said, I want you to listen to this while you're doing something else. I want you to think about this as you're going about your everyday life. I want to talk to your subconscious mind to prepare you for what's to come. And I feel like what I'm helping to prepare myself and share with others in reference to preparation is in no comparison to what the actual reality is going to be. And this is also an opportunity, and I feel like the last opportunity for queer people to face the fear, face the music. Because individuals who do not face the fear and are frozen by the fear, unfortunately, a lot of times do not make it. Okay? But before we get into this afternoon's live, Boom. Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act of 1976. Allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, education, and research. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing nonprofit, educational, or personal use. Tips the balance in favor of fair use. All the videos, songs, images, and graphics used in this live belong to their respective owners, and BubzDaGawd does not claim any right over them. So before we jump into the meat and potatoes of it all, let's go ahead and give y'all a little snippet of what we're about to get into. Okay? First video we're going to watch is from a YouTube channel by the name of Donna, and it's entitled The History of Psychiatry and Gay Conversion Therapy. Okay? Let's take a listen.
Because 1 out of 3 of you will turn queer. And if we catch you involved with a homosexual, your parents are going to know about it first. And you will be caught. Don't think you won't be caught. Because this is one thing you cannot get away with. This is one thing that if you don't get caught by us, you'll be caught by yourself. And the rest of your life will be a living hell.
Welcome to Psych.
Girl, what else do you need to hear? And again, this is men talking to who? Children, teenagers, youth. We get rid of the fucking adults, and we show the youth that if you become this, this is what will happen to you. Let's continue.
IRL. The attitudes of sexuality and its acceptance have fluctuated over time. In ancient Greece, homosexual relationships weren't as frowned upon as they were in the United States, say in the 50s. The phrase's meaning today may not even embody how the ancient Greeks thought of their relationships. The sacred band of Thebes, for example, were said to have been composed by same-sex male couples. It was theorized this would strengthen their protectiveness for one another, since the army was made up of lovers. In the beginning of the 12th century, hostility toward homosexuality began to grow in parts of Europe. Some sources have linked it to the growth of Christianity, but others have claimed it to start further back. Christianity's main approach was procreation. The more babies a Christian couple had, the faster Christianity would spread, because the couple would teach their kids, and their kids would teach their kids, and so on.
So that makes sense. Now I'm starting to have an epiphany of some sort. They think that queer people are trying to do the exact same thing that Christianity is trying to do, which is to have global domination. We just read about the mountain mandates last night, when in actuality, again, the queer community is the minority and will always and forever be the minority, because we are one and also one of the experiences of life that God, source, universe, consciousness has allowed for it to be experienced and to be expressed. I can only speak for me. I'm just trying to manifest the person that's meant for me, possibly have a family depending on what the fuck's gonna happen in these next 4 years, and also live the life that I desire, that is not actively harming anyone, because I'm walking in my truth. And if my truth makes you feel some type of way, well, maybe that's a personal problem again. But let's continue. Again, Christianity's purpose was for people to have children, not because they want to be able to have them connected with Christ for real, like in the Bible, in reference to how Christ actually walked and talked and expressed himself in this experience, but simply so that we can go ahead and have our own ideology that consumes the world, but that destroys the one thing that God gave every single one of us, which is free will. What's going on, Queen Spicy? Make sure y'all hit that like button, okay? Let's continue.
Homosexual relationships stood in the way of this goal and were therefore looked down upon. Other non-procreative sexual acts were also looked down upon, such as masturbation, oral sex, etc. Soon religious views began to be implemented into societal law. In the 13th century, males found to be partaking in homosexual behaviors were punished by castration or burning. In the 1900s, many sought out treatment for friends, children, and family members for homosexuality, but psychiatry and medicine didn't universally see it as a mental illness. Prominent psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud wrote a letter to a mother who sought treatment for her gay son. Homosexuality is assuredly no advantage, but it is nothing to be ashamed of. No vice, no degradation. It cannot be classified as an illness. We consider it to be a variation of the sexual functions produced by a certain arrest of sexual development. Unfortunately, this view would soon change in the 1940s after Freud's death. Other psychoanalysts, such as Sandor Rado, criticized Freud's views. He deemed homosexuality as unnatural and ultimately going against nature. Other psychoanalysts began to follow, such as Irving Bieber in 1962, who believed the cause was from a distant father and overbearing mother. These new theories introduced a number of gay conversion therapies, in which the goal was to reduce homosexual behavior and increase heterosexual behavior. Homosexuals could be involuntarily committed to psychiatric facilities by their families. They were subject to a number of practices, such as castration, aversion therapy. This included taking nausea-inducing drugs while watching same-sex erotica, so they could associate nausea with same-sex desires, or electroshock while watching the erotica, associating pain with same-sex desires. Other practices included lobotomies, where a pick-like instrument was inserted through the eye socket and into the brain. Patients were often left severely disabled. Now, all while this was—
Let's go back to that real quick, that list. Castration, aversion therapy, electric shock therapy, and lobotomy. And all of this is happening, or inspired, shall I say, by a group of people who profess and claim love. Love, we love. God is love, Jesus is love. Oh, he been there for you, never leave you nor forsake you, with you even until the ends of the earth. All these miraculous, wonderful things and stuff like that. None of that is present in any of this. None of that is present in anything on this list. Girl, it's gonna be one of those lives. Let's continue.
Pick-like instrument was inserted through the eye socket and into the brain. Patients were often left severely disabled. Now, all while this was happening, there was a growing amount of research that countered the theory of homosexuality as a pathology. Researchers found homosexual behavior occurring naturally in a percentage of animals. Also, the research used for the support of conversion therapy concluded homosexuals to have greater psychological disturbances compared to heterosexuals. A problem with those studies were the biases in the population. The participants recruited for those studies were from prison. Evelyn Hooker found no difference in psychological disturbances between straight and gay men when her study sampled men that weren't in prison. In 1973, homosexuality was removed from the DSM and replaced by something called ego-dystonic homosexuality. Its criteria involved: number 1, persistent lack of heterosexual arousal, which the patient experienced as interfering with initiation of maintenance of wanted heterosexual relationships. Number 2, persistent distress from a sustained pattern of unwanted homosexual arousal. Activists called for more action, saying this move from the APA was done to compromise for psychologists who made a livelihood from gay conversion therapy. In 1987, it was completely removed from the DSM. This resulted in a split from the psychological community. Many groups who advocated for keeping homosexuality as a mental disorder split and formed small groups such as Narth, Exodus, and Jonah, continuing conversion therapy. The years following led to many legal battles and some of these organizations shutting down. In Michael Ferguson versus Jonah, the New Jersey Civil Court was sued for deceptive practices. Some patients claimed the therapy not to work, reporting they were still attracted to the same sex. They also had to pay for mainstream therapy for the damages done in conversion therapy. Conservative groups in Welch versus Brown, ban of therapy in California, fought against the ban of conversion therapy, saying that it is a violation of free speech, freedom of religion, and privacy. Today, the law bans conversion therapy for minors in 5 states: California, Oregon, Illinois, Vermont, New Jersey, and DC. 45 states have no laws on conversion therapy.
So that is just, again, a little taste. Just a little taste. Okay? Of what the fuck we about to dive into, because again, over here on BubzDaGawd, we do our research, and what I realized too, which, I mean, I kind of figured this, but now that we here, I'm just gonna let some of my intrusive thoughts win more and more. You notice the people who claim that they have intellectual platforms and we have intellectuals over here, but meanwhile don't have no sources, don't show no videos, ain't on the live for no 5, 6, 7 hours dissecting a video like how the fuck we do over here, how we bring the stats over here, how we bring the articles over here, how we bring the arguments over here, and it really just be one leprechaun. But again, what I also realize is that a lot of people don't want to fucking learn. They don't want to learn. But want everyone to learn about them, everyone to know about them, everyone to see what they have to bring and what they have to offer. And again, we going back to through history. Again, to see the patterns. Again, to see the mistakes. And do what we can to not make those same mistakes again. And what they said at the beginning of that video makes even more sense to me, even now. The reason why there is such a gay panic, everything gay, 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 is because, again, in this country, there has been an ideology that you must be Christian in order to thrive. That being Christian is the cheat code in this world to be able to move your way up. But if your child happens to be queer-oriented or exploring their feelings in reference to finding out what it is that actually fucking works for them, now the devil, according to organized religion, has got a hold of your damn child. And if that happens, then that means we have to also look at you as the parent and figure out, how did this happen on your watch when you're the Christian? And then for that parent, they also have to deal with the stigmas that come with being the parent of a gay child. Again, you ain't do enough as a man. Or that as a wife, you did too much. To now somebody had to touch you. To now somebody had to put some gay shit on you. It's the gay grits, bitch. Again, to the point that if you had gay neighbors, gay relatives, other people who were queer and were not assimilating, they also put an expectation on you to call and to report these motherfuckers in. Because if you don't, you also gonna be penalized for that. And again, the list, y'all. The inhumane, Nazi-ass, experimental-ass shit they were trying on queer people. And because the Christians do have the money, girl, they do have the coin, bitch, they will pay people to do this so that these other people who are getting paid can carry out they sick, twisted ass, insidious ass experiments. And for the Christians, at least we'll be able to really show the gays who are in defiance how we really feel. And then popularize it through the media, press, to hopefully inspire the other queer people that we haven't gotten yet to, yeah, stop that gay shit. Or, since they know that they don't have the power to really remove queerness from this experience because they're not God, at least do it in the closet. And when you do, make sure you find me as well, because I've been wanting to fuck you. Do you see how twisted this shit is? And these are the individuals who are the representation of light and of love. When in actuality, the individuals in power that is able to make that happen, girl, they on some, hi, Georgie. Why don't you come over here, Georgie? I got a new sailboat for you, Georgie. Oh, it's down here. Come down here and get it, Georgie. On some It, the clown shit. Okay. Now we're going to get into the second video, which is going to break this down again with context and nuance. It's called Dismantling a Diagnosis, excuse me. Episode 1, A Kind of Madness, and this is from the Making Gay History YouTube channel that I discovered today. That if you are a queer person, I would suggest that you go ahead and subscribe and sit down and educate yourself. You're not gonna be able to get everything all the time from a 3-minute, 5-minute video. You got to dig into this shit and figure it out. And that's what we gonna do. So again, this is episode 1, A Kind of Madness. Make sure y'all hit the like button. Let's get it.
A kind of madness.
Well, for both of us, let me get it this way. My name is Harold L. Call, and I'm... You're running now. Mm-hmm. My name is Harold L. Call, and I'm Executive Director of the Mattachine Society, Incorporated. And your name is?
Eric Marcus.
Eric Marcus. Okay. Do you have any kind of an affiliation or whatever that I should know about?
No. I'm an independent writer working for Harper & Row on a new book, which doesn't have a title yet. It's an oral history of the struggle for gay rights, covering the period from 1945 to 1990. And you figure rather prominently in there, so that's why I'm here today to talk to you.
Okay, Eric. Well, we'll get going.
Interview with Morris Kite, Monday, August 21st, 1989. The location is the home of Morris Kite in Los Angeles, California. Interviewer is Eric Marcus, tape 1, side 1.
You were talking about areas of oppression, and I interrupted you.
Universities, education, high schools, textbooks taught that our love was abnormal, deviant, variant.
Interview with Frank Kameny, June 3rd, 1989, Washington, D.C., tape 2.
We were sick, we were sinners, we were perverts. You have your long litany of pejoratives. There was absolutely nothing whatsoever which anybody heard at any time, anywhere at all, which was other than negative. Nothing.
interview conducted at Hal Call's office in downtown San Francisco.
And did you think at the time that homosexuality was sick? Was that what the prevailing belief was? Mm-hmm. Did you believe that then?
No.
No.
I never believed it, but I know that that was the prevailing attitude among the behavioral scientists, psychiatrists and psychologists alike, and that was the doctrine they were teaching.
Barbara Giddings and Kay Tobin Lahusen.
At the time the movement started, which was the late 1940s, the early 50s, we were considered sick. People turned to psychiatrists for answers to the question of homosexuality. What causes it? What can we do about it? How can we eliminate it? So the sickness label infected everything that we said and did, and made it very difficult for us to have any credibility for anything we said for ourselves.
This is Making Gay History. I'm Eric Marcus. It was a kind of madness. I was born into a culture, into a society, that believed that because I'm gay, I must be mentally ill. During my childhood and early adolescence, American psychiatry said that my attraction to other boys was pathological, a disease that required treatment, a disease that could in some cases be cured. The first diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders, the DSM-1, was published by the American Psychiatric Association in 1952. It listed homosexuality as a sociopathic personality disturbance. By the time I was in my 30s and started working on my book about the gay and lesbian civil rights movement back in the late 1980s, mainstream psychiatry had moved on, and the dozens upon dozens of lesbians and gay men and bisexual people I interviewed were no longer deemed insane just because of who we loved or desired. 3 decades after that, when we launched this podcast, the belief that gay people could or indeed should be cured of their sexual desires had been banished to the fringes and was being outlawed in a growing number of places. But with progress comes amnesia. It's almost unimaginable now what the sickness label meant for the lives of millions and how it shaped the movement that fought to free us, not just from pseudoscience and damaging treatments, but to free us to live as equal members of society. We're releasing this Making Gay History miniseries exactly 50 years after the American Psychiatric Association passed a resolution stating that homosexuality was not a mental illness or sickness.
50 years, so we at the halfway fucking mark. This ain't something hundreds of years ago, even though racism is 400 plus, but still, something very, fairly fucking new. Despite all the actual contributions that queer people have made to this fucking world, to this fucking system, to this fucking country. And still, this is what's really going on. This is how y'all really feel. But again, I have to remind myself, as well as my other queer brothers and sisters and everybody in between, that that is how they feel about us. They are afraid of us. And a lot of them, and I'm gonna be bold enough to say it, are afraid of us because there is a part of us that is in them. This rabbit hole goes very fucking deep, and I want y'all to understand that at the end of the day, it's a mirror process on everybody. And people going forward, especially these next 4 years, are going to learn that, and learn that the hard way. Because now, when this shit happens, you may not be able to have the opportunity to go get therapy, to try to deal with your depression and shit because how fucked up life is getting. Y'all may not be able to have loved ones to be able to love and protect y'all for real. All the things that enhance queer people's lives and black people's lives and women's lives that are also part of humanity. It betters all of humanity because we're a part of it. But when you deny parts of humanity, you end up denying parts of yourself. And y'all not gonna continue to sit up here and to motherfucking use us for y'all pleasure, for y'all leisure, for y'all energy, and we don't get shit back. Because now we're in a space and a place right now in the age of Aquarius that means that, baby, it's really anybody's game. See, if y'all was real ass motherfuckers like y'all claim y'all were, y'all wouldn't have to use fear. Especially as your main ingredient. Because if you actually read the fucking book, it said it is love. It's with love that I draw these people. But we see what kind of love these motherfuckers have for us, and guess what? It's not a damn thing.
You're going to hear some of what that madness, the madness of the sickness label, meant for the lives of gay people, how that label fueled the fight for change, and how the legacy of that label and that fight filters into our lives today. So many of the people I interviewed for my book were only ones. Coming of age before Stonewall, they didn't know other gay kids, weren't out to their friends, they didn't see gay elders. So where does a person without a name for what they are, without a shared language for how they feel, where do you go to find yourself? In the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, you headed to the library. This is Act 1, On the Books.
Case notes: Morris Kite, confirmed homosexual, born November 19, 1919 in Comanche County, Texas. Involved with the movement since the 1950s, becoming a key organizer of early protests in Los Angeles, including Barney's Beanery.
Universities, education, high schools, textbooks taught that our love was abnormal, deviant, variant. When I enrolled at Texas Christian University in 1937, being bookish, I right away got a book pass, a stack pass, which is hard to get. It was a precious thing to have. And I rushed to the books to find out more about who I was. And the handful of books, I found me called sick, sinful, deviant, variant, aberrant, abnormal, and so on.
Case notes: Barbara Gittings, avowed lesbian, born July 31st, 1932
Devout
in Vienna,
lesbian.
Austria.
Damn, bitch, we devout
Sometimes
fags.
called the godmother of the gay civil rights movement.
You look yourself up in little sections in the book on abnormal psychology. And it's me they're talking about, but it's not me at all.
What did they say?
It was very clinical. It didn't speak of love. It didn't have very much humanity to it. They were talking about some kind of condition, an alien condition that was a departure from the norm. And it was something strange, and it was something odd. And it was possibly treatable, possibly not.
Case notes: Hal Call, pornographer and homosexual. Born September 1917, Grundy County, Missouri. Resided in San Francisco. Keen proponent of sexual liberation.
There were things by Dr. Albert Ellis, and those psychologists and behavioral scientists and therapists, you know, of that era.
Who were very critical of gays.
They were most of them, yes.
But gay people bought those books.
Well,
anyway.
yeah, we bought them. We had to buy them and read them because we had to see what the sons of bitches were saying about us, what we had to fight against. You see, that's the way we knew.
One book on abnormal psychology was 950 pages, and at least half those pages had to do with us. Could you imagine anyone in the world being so clever as to write 450 pages of drivel, shit, nonsense, pseudoscience, religion called education? Could you imagine 450 pages of case history? Interviewed Mr. X, a 31-year-old bachelor, celibate person, obviously abnormal, polymorphous, perverse, schizophrenic, with strong homosexual tendencies, very strong mother, weak father, and on and on and on, and that was 450 pages of that. So that was fairly oppressive, that education.
This is Act 2, Doctors and Diagnoses.
Case notes: J.J. Bélanger, born January 24th, 1923 in Alberta, Canada, professed to being in love with a fellow member of the Royal Canadian Air Force during World War II. After the war, worked as a sexologist. Claimed he worked with Dr. Alfred C. Kinsey, founder of the Institute for Sex Research.
Kraft-Ebing. He dealt with what was called Erningism, and homosexuality was not used at that time, but it was
Erningism.
Oh, right.
Deviation
Right.
and sort of nice little words like that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Kraft-Ebing. Psychopathia Sexualis was his title.
Mm-hmm.
And he was very graphic in sex acts and other little daring activities.
The most important oppressor that we ever had was the pseudoscience of psychiatry, psychoanalysis, largely developed between 1900 and 1910 by doctors Mesmer, Charcot, Sigmund Freud, and so on, who sniffed, these folk are not sinful, they're just sick. And so they wrote bodies of knowledge, bodies of expert information indicating that we were sick, and deviant, variant, aberrant, and as a result we picked up our very worst enemy. The worst enemy we ever picked up. They were a monolith against us because we made good trade, perfect for them to market their pseudoscience. They would come into court and testify against us and get huge fees for that.
A sexual psychopath, as defined by the law, has the privilege of being examined by a board of 3 psychiatrists sent to a state hospital for a period of from 90 days to 2 years. At the discretion of the judge is either released or then sentenced to serve a term in prison.
Dr. Matthew Ross, psychiatrist of the Student Health Service at UCLA, described the results of treating 133 homosexuals during the last 11 years. Homosexuality is not a disease in itself. It is a symptom of an underlying serious personality problem bordering on mental illness. A personality disorder which is subject to correction.
In almost 90% of the instances, neurotic.
One of many symptoms in mental illnesses. Psychotherapy naturally is here the treatment of choice.
When you say a pathology, do you mean a glandular physical problem?
Glandular treatment of homosexuality has occasionally been credited with some success. Something in the development went wrong during adolescence. Stuck on the immature phase of his or her development. Undue mother fixation in Oedipal or pre-Oedipal complexes, fear of being deprived of the mother's breasts. Full maturity never took place.
Case notes: Kay Lahusen, former Christian Scientist, partner of Barbara Gittings. Born January 5th, 1930, Cincinnati, Ohio. Spent the 1960s and 70s documenting the gay rights movement as a photojournalist.
Oh no, they're not sick. It's only an arrestation of development.
What's
arrestation of development?
Isn't that nice?
Yes, sure.
Arrestation of psychosexual development.
But that was on the assumption that everyone goes through a fixed set of stages, whereas in fact those vary according to the individual. Many gay people go through a heterosexual stage in childhood and then mature to their own adult homosexuality. But that didn't come along. That truth didn't appear for some time because of course the research was all being done in a cockeyed way. Instead of trying to find out objectively what causes homosexuality, a lot of the research was in the direction of what went wrong to produce homosexuality, and that's not the same question. A classic example is the famous Bieber study, which had enormous impact on the general public, believe it or not. It was a study by a group of psychoanalysts, and they were medical psychoanalysts. This study was not even an attempt to get direct information from gay male patients. It was only gay men, not lesbians. It was the psychoanalysts' recall of what their patients told them. So even that was not criticized. The Bieber study was so badly done from start to finish, and yet it did not attract the kind of criticism in the profession that it should have had. They should have torn it to shreds And with certain kinds of research, I'm sure they would be perfectly willing to sail into a shoddy piece of research like that and show it up for what it is. But for some reason, because the subject was homosexuality,
it advanced their economic cause. I mean,
they wanted patients to save.
Make money.
Act 3. The treatment.
Case notes: Alva Barker, born in Newcastle, Wyoming in 1920, a key member of the Mattachine Society in Denver, Colorado.
I went to psychotherapists.
What did they tell?
4 different ones.
What did they tell? Well, first, what were you looking for, and then what did they tell you?
I had been converted to the falsehood that it was a mental illness. Up until my senior year in high school, I accepted myself as I was and was well adjusted. Then when I began to read the literature that it was a mental illness, I thought, well, maybe I can get well. I can be heterosexual and have a family. It's the biggest mistake of my life. Then I read an article in Reader's Digest about Dr. Theodore R. Sarbin in Chicago, who was using hypnotherapy.
For homosexuals?
Yes. I thought, well, I'll be hypnotized into a heterosexual. I planned my vacation and went to Chicago one hot summer and saw him every day for over a week, except Sunday. Well, he tried to change me. Well, he couldn't hypnotize me. When I felt myself going under, I thought, isn't this interesting? I'm being hypnotized. And that broke the spell, and he wasn't able to do it again. But nevertheless, he kept trying. He said it's a matter of relaxation, suggestion to the unconscious mind. And so it's different. There are different degrees of hypnosis, he explained. Well, that didn't do any good.
Did you tell him what you were there for?
Oh, yes.
And
sure.
what did he say?
He was going to help me become heterosexual.
Uh-huh.
He made suggestions to me about sex with women and to try it, which I did once.
And?
With a lesbian at the University of Denver.
Come on, lesbian.
A total flop. We didn't magnetize one another. Total flop.
Case notes: Joyce Hunter, lesbian. Born in April 1939, the daughter of an unmarried teenaged Orthodox Jewish mother and an African-American father. Grew up in a group home, only to return to abuse in the home of her birth parents. Self-described butchy kid from the Bronx. Attempted suicide.
I didn't know what it meant to be gay. I had no idea. I just thought I was this odd entity, you know. And all I heard when I was growing up in the 50s was really negative stuff. You were sick, you were a sinner. It scared the hell out of me. I thought that somebody was gonna...
Protecting the kids, right?
Come after me.
Yeah.
And I definitely didn't want my parents to know. I was in a situation that was pretty violent. My father was very abusive, yeah. And so the homosexuality was a factor. The family situation was a factor. And of course, I didn't see any future. I didn't see, you know, how things could get better. I just thought they were going to get worse, although I couldn't imagine it being worse. And I just thought it would be easier to be dead than to live. Wow. My mother was like banging on the door, and I stopped. And she took me to the hospital. They carted me off to state hospital. And I was a kid, and so, and I think there was questions about my sexuality. I spent my 18th birthday in a state hospital.
Not a happy 18th birthday.
Mm-mm.
So you saw a psychiatrist there then?
Once.
Once?
Once. You served time there.
Really?
I swear to God, that's how it was to me. When I got there, I was fingerprinted, and they took a picture of you, so it was like a mugshot. It was so dehumanizing, and I felt like I had did something so terrible. They kept me there I was away for almost a year, I guess. And they had me talk to a psychiatrist, and then after that, periodically somebody would come and talk to me, and I worked. Basically, you just work your way out of there. I got real hip to what was going on there, and I didn't complain about anything until after I did one crazy incident. I threw the food. I said, this food's not fit for a dog, and I flung it. and they don't treat you too well when you do things like that. Give you shots in the butt and, you know, stuff like that. When I got out, the follow-up was that I was to go for therapy. They didn't do any there. They just got a year's good work out of me. Waste of my time, just a waste of my time. Anyways, so when I came out, I started seeing a therapist. Told me, if you get married, it'll go away.
Did it go away?
No. I was married 1 year, and then I met this woman, my first adult lover, while I was married. And I fell in love with a woman, and I kept it a secret. I mean, I was I had never experienced any kind of feeling like that ever. You know, not with no guy.
Girl, we ain't gotta lie. We ain't gotta lie. We ain't gotta motherfucking lie. We ain't gotta lie. We ain't gotta lie. Like, come on. Like, what more do y'all need to hear? What more do y'all need to see? And since we in this thing, bitch, we gonna give you hoes everything so that when shit hit the fan, I want you to understand how much blood is on y'all hands. I want y'all to understand that. Okay?
The torture.
What's up, Aaron? What's up?
Billy Talmadge, case notes. Born in Missouri, December 7th, 1929. Raised in Oklahoma. Worked as an elementary school teacher, but had a double life.
Aaron, I hope you talking about this on your platform too. Cause the way we going, ain't gonna be no more chasing, ain't gonna be no more Gemini films, ain't gonna be no more reviewing of that shit, that baddie shit, all the shit y'all like talking about, girl. All that shit, they gonna send it to hell. So I hope y'all having some conversations like about stuff like this. Use y'all reading powers for good.
As a secret lesbian activist, an early member of the Daughters of Belides homophile group, claims she counseled other lesbians.
At that point in time, we finally got homosexuality out of the criminal category and into the medical category. Then all of the medics jumped into it and wanted to cure them. See, a lot of people came to us with really, you know, really disturbed people, beyond the normal pale of just being homosexual and trying to live with it back in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. Some of them that had problems that homosexuality was just a minute little tiny part of the problem. And we were well aware of this. And we tried for years to find a psychologist who would work with us, who would counsel some of these people, that we could say, we can refer you to this person. Remember, there were not many women psychologists in those days, hardly any women psychiatrists. And we interviewed several, and all of them men. And
you say that with
because
anger
those are
in
the
your
only,
eyes.
I am, because two of them, we referred two people, and the first thing they did was try to cure them on the couch.
On the couch?
That's right. They attacked both women that we referred them to. And
not standard procedure, exactly.
In any sense of the word.
Yeah.
But in a sense, yes, it was, because at that point of time, they were trying to cure homosexuality.
Did you hear stories from women who came to DOB about that?
Yeah.
These monsters did lobotomies, aversive conditioning, behavioral modification. They provided anectine, acetylene, and mind-altering drugs, and did lobotomies and electroconvulsive shock therapy. Imagine trying to burn out of your brain your love. Good grief, this is genocide.
They have to kill me.
No, I don't know. Don't be so bright. You might easily have given in to them.
Oh, if someone applied electrodes to me, I'd say anything, probably.
Okay.
You must have seen people who had been through that mill.
One of my oldest counselees, one of my oldest living counselees, a very old man, I certainly would do nothing whatever to even vaguely identify who, where, or what state he's in, but he's a continuing counselee, is a functioning honest, achieving adult, badly, badly blunted, because his family in an eastern state, knowing of his homosexuality, mistook that for a sickness. These were good people, by the way, really good people. All I've interviewed him over the years tells me that they're good people. And they submitted him for electroconvulsive shock therapy, conditioning. And 2 days a week, he went to the state hospital for it. And the doctors were so crude, so crass, so unprofessional, such agents of torture, that they left the room door open where the previous patient was receiving his or her shock therapy, and he observed their body convulsing and them screaming and vomiting. You could see that through the door, and he was on a gurney waiting to be the next one going in.
Wow.
They burned out of him some sensibility, some motor facility, but he's still homosexual. He's as homosexual as he ever was.
Now he fucked up. Y'all need to learn and listen.
Imagine trying to burn out of your brain your love. Good grief. Psychiatrists who claimed the sickness label was a kindness to gay people, that it was better than being criminalized, better than being damned for all time, were willfully ignoring the fact that pathologizing homosexuality provided cover for those other forms of oppression too.
Wow.
It legitimized the widespread victimization of gay people. In the 1950s and 60s, you could lose your home and your job if you were outed. Professionals like teachers, accountants, lawyers, and yes, even psychiatrists could have their licenses revoked. Landlords could evict gay tenants. You wouldn't want a sexual psychopath around, would you? It led families to seek out brutal and damaging treatments for their loved ones in a misguided effort to cure them. The sickness label seemed like an impossible trap to escape, because at a time when mental illness was even more stigmatized than today, if you're crazy, why should anyone listen to you?
The problem with the sickness label is that that supposedly is scientific and not subject to dispute. And therefore it's harder to move it. It's harder to make a dent in it, to make a chink in it somewhere. And I'm delighted that it moved as fast as it did, although I will say we spent a lot of years fighting it.
Next time on Making Gay History,
which we're going to get into next. Okay? That's why I say history is motherfucking important. And again, for the people that are scared, the people I don't want to hear this, la 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 la, you gonna have to make a choice. Ain't no riding the motherfucking fence. Did you just hear what the hell I heard? When there were people who willingly were subjecting themselves to this in hopes that maybe I can change and be a part of overall society. And these motherfuckers rude to you, crass to you, leaving the fucking door open and shit. Like we in some twisted Outlast video game or some shit. Motherfuckers convulsing and screaming and throwing up and shit, and then knowing you're next in line, girl. But I'd rather go through this to prove that I'm trying to change and possibly lose my life, as opposed to walking in my truth and losing my life faster. And again, these are the same people who claim to follow someone who's able to raise the dead, to heal the sick. I ain't never seen in the scriptures or read in the scriptures Jesus Christ turning into Pinhead from Hellraiser. We have such sights to show you. No. Oh, but we ain't done. We are not done. And again, shout out to the queer people that are still here. Shout out to the heterosexual people who also dealing with their guilt and shame about other heterosexual people doing this to queer people, and even some down low queer people doing it to queer people. Shout out to y'all for still sitting here and sitting through this as well, because again, Bubs, the motherfucking God, the one that they call mentally ill, the one that they call trying to be a girl and trying to transition, the one that they say that is immoral and demonic and sexually deviant and is just waiting for children to come along like I'm motherfucking Freddy Krueger in this bitch. Let's see who can prove what, because again, they can't prove objectively any of that. But as far as their ignorances and biases and hatred, and in some cases, bitch, some of they motherfucking down low, self-loathing, homoerotic type of bullshit, locker room bullshit. Okay, girl, let's just go. Let's just go. Let's just go. Let's just go, girl. Because don't just take my word for it, girl. Here we go.
On December 15th, 1973, the Board of Trustees of the American Psychiatric Association, also known as the APA, approved a resolution striking homosexuality from the list of mental disorders in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It was, in the words of the newly founded National Gay Task Force, the greatest gay victory. And it felt to many like it had happened fast, as though this psychiatric orthodoxy had just been swept away in the tidal wave of post-Stonewall gay liberation activism. But to understand how the sickness label, a label that had been used to persecute so many, was overturned so seemingly easily, we're turning back the clock to before Stonewall, to the decade before, to the 1950s.
We were cured overnight by a stroke of the pen, just as originally we'd been made sick by probably a stroke of the pen.
This is Making Gay History. I'm Eric Marcus. Welcome back to our special mini-series marking 50 years since we gay folks were cured with the stroke of a pen.
Especially if you queer, we gotta do our work, we gotta educate ourselves.
Was not in fact
they not
itself
gonna do it,
a
so
mental
we gotta
illness.
do it.
This is episode 2, The Cure. Act 1, Secret Societies and Dr. Alfred Kinsey.
Yes. Who's speaking, please?
Well, I'd rather remain anonymous.
All right.
I'd like to address my question to the caller.
Yes.
Is there a place that
The audio is hard to make out,
Yes,
but an anonymous caller is asking, is there a place or an organization that a homosexual can seek aid from?
Yes, there are several organizations in the United States today. The Mattachine Society, of which I am a representative, the Daughters of Bilitis, one incorporated of Los Angeles, a group called the League for Civil Education in San Francisco. All of these organizations will refer individuals in trouble or in conflict with the law to competent attorneys, and they will refer individuals in various other kinds of trouble, religious, psychiatric situations which indicate professional counseling or therapy is necessary, and many other types of aid to individuals who call upon them. They are not advocating or upholding the idea of homosexuality. They are simply recognizing that it does exist in nature and always has been with us, and that laws and attitudes to the contrary have actually not reduced the incidence of it one whit. We've spent a lot of effort trying to do that, but it doesn't seem to have worked.
That scratchy old tape is from a panel discussion at the 4th annual convention of the early gay rights group, the Mattachine Society, in 1957 in Denver. I'm pretty sure that's Hal Call speaking. You're going to get the chance to meet him a little later in the show. And as he just told that worried anonymous caller, the early gay groups focused on mutual aid, challenging police entrapment, and education. They also held anonymous discussion groups so people could, perhaps for the first time in their lives, talk to other gay people about what it meant to be gay. That tape is from a trove of recordings from the 1950s that Donald Lucas, a member of Mattachine, had held onto for decades. I interviewed Don for my book back in July of 1989. We spoke in his dusty, messy office next to the basement garage of Don's house in San Francisco. He'd had a serious heart attack, and the medication he was taking had jumbled his memories, so I wasn't able to include him in my book. But as we talked, piled all around us in his office and even on top of his aging car in the garage were scores of boxes full of papers, files, and...
Did you see the tapes up there?
Yes.
Those are all just dozens and dozens of conversations.
Don Lucas had recorded all the Mattachine conventions and hours of panel discussions and Mattachine Society meetings. Among the recordings are Mattachine panels featuring psychiatrists describing gay people as arrested in their development and psychopathological.
You also invited in psychologists who considered gay people sick.
Oh, yes.
Many people cannot fathom why you did that.
Because they were in the majority.
Can you elaborate on that for me? And I'm not making any judgment. I'm just curious. Curious why.
The majority of the psychiatric world at that time considered homosexuality an illness, and so he tried to get both sides involved in a debate, in a dialogue, so that people could learn through this educational process. You can't educate in a vacuum. So you have to have both sides of any question in order to come to a debate. And, oh yes, we were criticized many times for doing that. I have all the tapes of all those things.
All these years later, I was so glad to discover that Don's basement archive had survived. But I digress. Archives are my love language. You just heard Don explain how the Mattachine Society discussion groups included talks from psychologists who agreed with the official Psychiatric Diagnostic Manual, the DSM, that homosexuality was a mental illness. Inviting those speakers is baffling now. It was baffling by the time I interviewed him at the end of the 1980s. But this was the 1950s. The movement for gay rights was in its infancy. The Mattachine was highly secretive, and that secrecy was born of fear. Members were anonymous, many used pseudonyms. When the Mattachine Society was first founded, it had a kind of cell structure based on the example of the Communist Party. Some of Mattachine's founders had been Communist Party members. They used that secretive structure in an effort to protect themselves, so if one branch or cell of the society was discovered or targeted by the authorities, the others could remain hidden. The Daughters of Bilitis, also known as DOB, was the earliest lesbian group in America, founded in 1955, and it was also very careful in what it said and how it publicized its activities, as former DOB member Barbara Giddings told me when I interviewed her in 1989.
If you said that you were, you were providing ways for homosexuals to meet each other, this could possibly put you in violation of the law for procurement in some places, and it certainly would bring down the ire of people who might find out about it and say, this is disgusting. Here they are, arranging to meet each other through these organizations. Let's knock them out of existence. And they didn't want to jeopardize their existence.
While most individual members of these early organizations were trying to remain hidden from view, by the 1950s, homosexuals as a group had entered the national consciousness in a big way. Dr. Alfred C. Kinsey and a group of researchers had formed the Institute for Sex Research in Bloomington, Indiana in 1947. In 1948, Kinsey and colleagues published Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. Sexual Behavior in the Human Female was published in 1953. It's hard to overstate the earthquake these reports set off in American society. That first Kinsey report found that nearly 37% of the adult male subjects had had at least one homosexual experience, and that 10% of American males surveyed were, quote, more or less exclusively homosexual for at least 3 years between the ages of 16 and 55. When Dr. Kinsey and his team wanted to gather more data for ongoing research at the Institute, they sought out the early gay groups. Here's Billy Talmadge, who was a member of the Daughters of Bilitis at the time.
We were the very first group to be interviewed by the Kinsey Institute. We asked for that. We badgered at their door to try to get some kind of involvement, and got it. And they interviewed us as couples, and they interviewed us as individuals.
Were you interviewed for it?
Oh yes, Shorty and I both were.
What sorts of things did they must have asked everything, I assume.
Yeah, they did. You know, we put it before our membership and said, you know, if you want to do this, then volunteer, but know that you're opening the door for all kinds of questions. And we got quite a number of volunteers, quite a number of people did this. See, that took guts and real courage.
Hal Call joined the Mattachine Society in San Francisco in 1953. A World War II vet and a journalist, he had moved west a year earlier after he was fired from his job at the Kansas City Star for being gay. Hal was part of a push for the society to be a little less secretive.
I was a journalist and a public relations man, and I knew that, or I felt that education and getting the word out was the best thing we could do. We had the Mattachine phone number in our telephone book here in the city of San Francisco, and the Kinsey group in Bloomington, Indiana, was soon in contact with us as soon as they found out that we had Mattachine discussion groups and a Mattachine entity going here in San Francisco.
You might expect the jolt of awareness from Kinsey's research that gay people were everywhere could also spark a moment of pride and liberation. But this was the 1950s. It was a dangerous time to be gay, and the reaction to Kinsey's research helped fuel a brutal crackdown on gay people in the form of the Lavender Scare, which paralleled the better-known Red Scare. Thanks to a 1953 executive order signed by President Dwight D. Eisenhower, gay people in federal employment were investigated, exposed, and fired as a moral panic took hold of government. Homosexuals were sick and dangerous. All were seen to be potential security risks. Culturally, the backlash following the Kinsey reports reinforced the all-American, heterosexual, nuclear family as the only healthy moral life to be lived.
Was Dr. Evelyn Hooker one of the people you worked with?
Oh my God, yes. I love Evelyn. Well, I've known her since 1953 when she was president at some of those early meetings we had.
Act 2. Dr. Hooker and the men.
May we start by asking Dr. Hooker first if there are specific questions, well, pardon me, before we start the discussion group, I must ask one question. Is there anyone present who would object to our discussion group being transcribed? Since we use no names, it's rather hard to conceive that anyone would object, but if there is any objection.
I have a question.
Yes.
Why should it be recorded?
It be recorded so that we may have a permanent record.
Could I add something to that,
Sure.
Chuck? If it were recorded, I should be very grateful for your comments and questions about the things which I've said here. And since I obviously won't be able to remember everything that's said, but I don't mean that as pressure, obviously.
Then may I state that toward the end we will turn off the recording, and if there's anyone who wishes to ask a question off the record, then we can take them.
Can we turn the tape over?
This recording was made in 1954 with Dr. Evelyn Hooker, a trailblazing psychologist. In May of that year, at the Western Psychological Association in Long Beach, California, Dr. Hooker had presented a paper titled, "Inverts Are Not a Distinct Personality Type." Invert was another word for homosexual back then. Dr. Hooker had come to Mattachine to share her findings. While the discussion portion of the meeting...
Girl, we was all type of shit, bitch. Invert, sick, twisted, sexual deviants, bitch. Burners, or what they call them? Yeah, burnings or some shit. Burners. What?
wasn't recorded, they stopped the tape rolling to protect the anonymity of Mattachine's members. Dr. Hooker's presentation, a repeat performance of her Long Beach speech, was among Don Lucas's tapes.
I'm now reading, as I read to the psychologist at Long Beach, it is apparent from the preceding discussion that no clear and distinct homosexual type emerges from this preliminary and admittedly superficial exploration. It may be asked whether on this test there are any items on which homosexuals do agree. I can report that there is only one such item, and it is that nudist colonies are not a threat to the moral life of the nation. This really has a very serious implication. I can see we really got off to a bad start. You may be surprised to learn, you won't be surprised to learn, that one of the group agrees, and all the rest disagree, with the statement, a sex pervert is an insult to humanity and should be punished severely. But this individual, who agrees with the statement, notes in the margin, a homosexual is not a pervert. Now, these are the major conclusions, and I think I've talked enough, and there's a lot of other data here for you to ask questions, but and also to make comments and pick up at any point that you want to on this.
Dr. Hooker wanted feedback from Mattachine members on her invert paper, but she had an additional motive for talking to the Mattachine Society. She needed subjects for a new research project. Back in the 1940s, a gay friend had pressed her to prove what he knew to be true, that homosexuals were no crazier than anyone else.
Sammy turned to me and said, we don't need psychiatrists, we don't need psychologists, we're not insane, we're not any of those things they say we are, and it is now your scientific duty to make a study of people like us.
It took her a few years to find the time and the funding for a study like the one her former student and friend, Sam Fromm, had lobbied her to do. By 1954, she had funding and time, but she needed men. She was planning a study that would question the very underpinnings of the sickness label, comparing the adjustment, or well, relative sanity, of heterosexual and homosexual men. No one had thought to conduct such a study before. The Mattachine Society was the perfect place to find the gay men she needed. It was a ready-made study group, ready, willing, and able to contribute to her research. When Dr. Hooker presented the results to the American Psychological Association in Chicago in 1957, it was momentous.
It was held in a big ballroom in one of the big hotels, the air was electric. It was just electric. And of course, there were people, some, not too many, but there were some people who were saying, well, of course, that can't be right. And they set off to try to prove that I was crazy.
Why was it so electric?
What was so electric about it? Well, if you're challenging a long and commonly held position, and you know that there are thousands of lives at stake.
Dr. Hooker had delivered the assignment her friend had set for her over a decade earlier. Through a series of tests using accepted predictive techniques and with a panel of esteemed psychiatrists who affirmed her findings in a blind reading of the results, she had proven that gay men were no crazier than straight men. The psychiatric consensus was shaken, but there was a gaping hole in her research.
You didn't duplicate your study for women, for gay women, lesbians.
I didn't what?
Do the same. You didn't do a similar study for lesbians.
No.
I'm curious as to
why
not.
Well, I don't think that it would. I don't think that I could have done it as easily.
And not only that, at least with lesbians, sorry, meat and banana bread. You can get up in between that though. So as long as the lesbians down to have some quote unquote real dick in the mix, ain't no problem. But it's always going to be catered more of that energy towards gay men. Those were the ones that were attacked the most. Especially from Christian ideology. The man, how dare you're failing as a man, how dare you not fit into the status quo, patriarchy, toxic masculinity, why not? indoctrinate yourself, immerse yourself, and bathe yourselves in the waters and the lakes of toxic masculinity. But you want to do this fag shit? Let's continue.
So when, they used to say to me, once the results were known, and so on and so on, and they would say, why didn't you do for us what you did for the gay men? And I said, you didn't ask me.
And the men did.
And the men did. And of course it's true.
And she told us she could not, because professionally, she'd be dead.
Why is that?
They would not accept it.
Gay women didn't exist?
Not that gay women didn't exist, but that a woman studying gay women would be highly, highly suspect on any information she gave. She was a very close friend.
So even me giving gay history because I'm a gay man, girl, they already telling me that shit out. Girl, we don't believe you gay, you biased. Oh, okay.
And she would come to all of our meetings and conferences and panels and things like this, but she never did a study on gay women.
We'll never know exactly why Dr. Hooker didn't include women in her research. Whether it was because they didn't ask, as she told me, or because she feared sexism and homophobia would undermine her findings, which is what Daughters of Bilitis member Billy Talmadge said. But the aftershocks of Hooker's groundbreaking study on men would reverberate across the gay rights movement. And while Dr. Hooker's research didn't immediately overturn the APA's definition of homosexuality, it laid vital groundwork. Now, someone else needed to pick up the ball and run with it. Act 3. We are the experts on ourselves.
In the movement, the feeling was a level of uncertainty. We had to defer to the experts.
Oh, you hated that, didn't you?
Frank Kameny was a victim of the Lavender Scare. He was fired from his government job in 1957 because he was gay. The persecution radicalized him. In 1961, he founded the Mattachine Society of Washington, D.C. The new outpost of Mattachine was very much a reflection of Frank's personality and his goals.
My answer was, we are the experts on ourselves, and we will tell the experts they have nothing to tell us. But it took a few years to get that across.
Frank was both blessed and burdened with an unshakable certainty about his position on any given subject. His brusque and uncompromising manner rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, but he was extraordinary in his vision for the movement. He was also very persistent.
One of my fights, which I started in '63, and took 10 years to succeed in, and was picked up by others, was the fight against the American Psychiatric Association.
While Frank was champing at the bit in Washington, over at the Daughters of Bilitis, members Barbara Giddings and her life partner, the photojournalist Kayla Husen, were also growing impatient with DOB and the posture of the pre-Stonewall movement. They were ready to buy whatever Frank was selling. Here's Kay talking to me in 1989 about the tensions between the homophile old guard and Frank's bold ambitions. Barbara can't help but chime in too. I'm sorry for the paper rustling. I think that was me wrestling with my notes.
And, it was Frank who said that we have to proclaim that in the absence of valid evidence to the contrary, we're well. We're not sick. And that the burden of proof rests on those who would call us sick. And then Florence Conrad of DOB said that no one would listen to us. And Frank says, so what? If no one listens, we
haven't lost anything, right?
If someone listens, we've gained something.
And he said, even if it's only that gay person out in Iowa,
right,
who feels encouraged by hearing somebody stand up and say this on our behalf, right, that's to the good. Well, that made great sense to us, and we liked the the fervor behind this, and it seemed to be very good common sense. We don't wait around for the experts to declare us normal.
We started at that point to take on the American Psychiatric Association.
But the only people who could actually declassify homosexuality as a mental illness were the members of the American Psychiatric Association. So these activists who were hungry for, well, action, needed to find a way to appeal to the APA's members. Act 4, Outsiders on the Inside. Dr. Judd Marmer was a member of the APA. He didn't start out as an ally. Like the rest of his profession, he agreed with the sickness label. But when he heard Dr. Evelyn Hooker's groundbreaking paper in 1957, he didn't dismiss it out of hand. She was a good friend of his, and he admired her work.
When she made the statement that homosexuality was not an illness, at the first time I heard her, I wasn't prepared to go all the way. I was sympathetic to what she was saying. I wasn't offended by what she was saying, but I wasn't totally convinced. I still had a feeling that it was a developmental deviation and that we were making a lot of assumptions about the so-called homosexual personality that weren't warranted. But I still wasn't ready to assume that there was something other than a developmental deviation involved in it.
But over the next 7 years, Dr. Marmer's position evolved. And when a publisher approached him and asked him what he would like to write a book about, he knew he wanted to write about homosexuality.
I said, I feel that my colleagues' views about homosexuality are wrong. And he said, great, let's do a book on that. So I did. The book was called Sexual Inversion, the Multiple Roots, R-O-O-T-S, of Homosexuality. And that was published in 1965.
Dr. Marmer invited a number of psychologists and psychiatrists to contribute to his book, including his friend Dr. Evelyn Hooker. Some of the authors were still writing in support of the sickness label. But Judd Marmer was growing increasingly uncomfortable with his colleagues' views on homosexuality.
What I did point out in that book is that the assumption that this was an illness was based on a skew sample, that psychoanalysts only saw disturbed homosexuals in their offices. And I said, if we made our judgment about the mental health of heterosexuals only from the patients we saw in our office, we'd have to assume that all heterosexuals were mentally disturbed. And I was appalled by the stereotypic generalizations that were being made about homosexuals in the various psychoanalytic meetings I was going to. I was still a young analyst, but I'd go to meetings and I'd hear about the homosexual personality and about the fact that homosexuals were vindictive, aggressive, couldn't have decent relationships, were not to be trusted, all terribly nasty, negative, disparaging things. And I knew gay men and women, and this just didn't make sense to me. And that's one of the points I attacked strongly in my book, that this was a stereotyping of a group that really concealed a prejudice.
Dr. Marmer's new outlook and his book got the attention of some in the APA.
And it was considered a relatively revolutionary statement.
You must have taken a lot of heat for that.
Oh, I did. But one of the rewarding things is that at meetings of the American Psychiatric Association,
oh, Deshaun, baby, this
psychiatrists
motherfucking
began
lie.
to
You
come
might have
up
to go back to the beginning and rewatch
and
it.
say, look, I want to tell you how much I appreciated your book. I'm gay. Now, the psychiatrists whom I came to know, who ultimately formed a group within the APA, which they called the Gay PA.
Who were some of the people then who were involved?
I think I'd rather not mention their names because some of them may never have come out of the closet.
There had been for years a kind of gay PA meeting during the time of the annual APA conference, but it was a very closeted affair. They would meet privately off conference premises in a restaurant in the host city, and it was all gay psychiatrists, but they were definitely not open. And there were just beginning to be the stirrings among a few of this group, the Gay PA, that they might want to do something a little more open in their own association, but still nothing very definite had happened.
Nothing very definite had happened yet.
Yeah.
But that was about to change. In separate interviews for my book in 1989, Dr. Marmer, Barbara Giddings, and Kay Lahusen shared the story of what happened next. So I'm going to step back and let them take it from here.
We had some very dramatic confrontations. During the 70s, the gay liberation movement became very vocal and began to appear at APA meetings and demanded a voice.
In 1970, a large group of feminists and a few gays invaded a behavior therapy meeting at the American Psychiatric Association's conference, which was in San Francisco that year. They disrupted the meeting and said, in effect, stop talking about us and start talking with us.
These were days in which homosexuality was being treated by aversive therapy, by shock therapy and things like that. And the gay people were justly very angry at that. They demanded that they be given a session in which they could present their views.
The American Psychiatric Association conference managers are very smart people, and they are not about to let themselves get kicked year after year by some group that wants to invade to get its message across. So they turned around and the very next year invited gay people to be on a panel called Lifestyles of Non-Patient Homosexuals, which we informally called Lifestyles of Impatient Homosexuals. And this was the very first time that the American Psychiatric Association had even conceded that there were homosexuals who were not patients in therapy. Because every time the subject had been brought up in previous conferences, it was always, we were patients in therapy there for treatment. Well, this was a recognition that there are gays who do not come for therapy. It was successful. It wasn't a huge turnout, but it was a successful thing. And the next year, we were invited to have a panel.
There was the head of the lesbian movement at that time, whose name I can't
Barbara Giddings?
Barbara was there, and the fellow from Washington.
Frank Kameny.
Frank Kameny was there. So Frank was on the panel, and Barbara was on the panel, and I was on the panel. It was a very dramatic session with this fellow from Philadelphia with a grotesque mask on. Somewhere I have a picture of it.
You do?
If I can locate it, I'll
if you can locate it, that would be wonderful.
Oh, this is Dr. Anonymous at the American Psychiatric Association.
I took that picture.
That's Kay's picture.
That's
Yes,
mine.
that's Kay's photo. Well, at the left is myself, Barbara Giddings. Next to me is Franklin Kameny, and we were the two non-psychiatrist gay panelists.
What was this event that you were speaking?
This was the American Psychiatric Association's annual conference.
This was in May of 1972.
Well,
Is
you
that
may
my
be right.
name on?
This is from Judd Marmer's collection.
Oh, we must have sent it to Judd Marmer.
Here we were, Frank and I, and Kay said, this was all Kay's doing. She said, well, look, oh yes, there were to be a couple of psychiatrists. I think Judd Marmer was one of them. And she said, look, you have psychiatrists who are not gay on the panel, and you have gays who are not psychiatrists on the panel. But what you're lacking on the panel is gay psychiatrists, those who are both. And she said, why don't we try to get a gay psychiatrist? Well, the moderator was perfectly agreeable, but he said, you know, find somebody for me. And I made a number of calls to some of the people that I'd made some contacts with, and nobody yet was quite willing to be that public.
Why? What would have happened if someone...
They feared a damage to their careers. But finally, I talked with this one man who said, well, I will do it, provided I am allowed to wear a wig and a mask and use a distort microphone. And that's what he did. He was billed in the program as Dr. H. Anonymous. That was the way he wanted to be billed. And he was going to talk about what it was like to have to live in the closet because of career constraints as a gay psychiatrist. And what I did to back him up was to write to all of the others that I knew, gay psychiatrists, and say, please send me a few paragraphs about what it's like to be a gay psychiatrist in the association. You do not have to sign it. I will read these at the APA convention. And I told H. Anonymous that I was going to do this so that he wouldn't be the only one speaking in effect. There would be other voices behind him, even if their names weren't attached to their statements. It went off marvelously. H. Anonymous got into his mask
and spoke into a microphone that concealed his voice and admitted that he was gay. This was an unheard of thing to have done, and it was very dramatic.
I'm a homosexual. I am a psychiatrist. I, like most of you in this room, am a member of the APA and am proud of that membership. Tonight, however, I am, insofar as it is possible, a we. I attempt tonight to speak for many of my fellow gay members of the APA, as well as for myself. When we gather at these conventions, we have somewhat glibly come to call ourselves the Gay PA. And several of us feel that it is time that real flesh and blood stand up before this organization and ask to be listened to and understood insofar as that is possible. I am in disguise tonight in order that I might speak freely without conjuring up much regard on your part about the particular whom I happen to be. I do that mostly for your protection. I can assure you that I could be any one of more than 200 psychiatrists registered at this convention, or more.
Why did it, how do you mean that it came off very well? What was...
First of all, it was, the house was packed. And everyone, of course, wanted to see H. Anonymous. Naturally, I think he's the reason that the house was packed. And let's face it, the man's physical size meant that I'm sure there were people who would recognize him in spite of the microphone and the wig. But he was willing to take that chance. He didn't seem to mind that. He felt that he'd given himself sufficient cover. He made a very eloquent presentation. And then the statements that I read from other psychiatrists sort of clinched it. It was an extremely successful program.
Thanks to activists rattling the cage from the outside and allies providing cover and solidarity to the gay psychiatrists on the inside, it seemed as if the stuffy old APA was inching in the direction of change. As we wrapped up our conversation about that dramatic and consequential APA conference, Barbara and Kay insisted we look at one more photograph Kay had taken in Dallas back in 1972.
I know in Dallas,
this is what the...
with Phil, what's his name, Johnson?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Yes. There's a formal dinner as part of the conference activities each year. And Frank, as a guest of the association, who was one of the formal speakers that year, Frank Hammoney, was given a ticket to this thing, and he invited Phil Johnson, a local gay activist, and they danced together. Oh, that was wonderful. I think this one was probably one of the first public, displays of, well, the psychiatrists, of course, they have to keep their cool. Nobody pounced on them and destroyed them. No, of course not, but I'm sure they were shocked by it. Anyway, Frank had a wonderful time. Phil had a wonderful time.
Look at that.
That's Phil Johnson with Frank Hammoney dancing away at the formal, at the formal dinner.
And then a year later, we had an official debate. The debate about the DSM-3 had already begun.
DSM-3?
The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And the debate about whether or not homosexuality was an illness began. And at this official debate, which was chaired by Bob Spitzer, but on the platform, representing various points of view, were myself, Richard Green, he's the man who wrote the Sissy Boy Syndrome, Robert Stoller,
Sissy Boy.
And Charles Socarides, and Irving Bieber. This was a very, very dramatic debate, which was attended by several thousand psychiatrists. There was also a young man who, whose name I can't remember. He was the spokesman for the caucus, very outspoken, who made a talk also and said, "Stop it, you're making me sick."
Act 5, You're Making Me Sick.
Since I've joined the gay liberation movement, I've come to an unshakable conclusion. The illness theory of homosexuality is a pack of lies, concocted out of the myths of a patriarchal society for a political purpose.
Honolulu, May 1973. The young man on stage at the APA's annual meeting was Ron Gold, a member of the Gay Activist Alliance, the Gay Liberation Front, and the brand new National Gay Task Force.
Psychiatry, dedicated to making sick people well, is the cornerstone of a system of oppression that makes gay people sick. To be viewed as psychologically disturbed in our society is to be thought of and treated as a second-class citizen. And being a second-class citizen is not good for my mental health. That isn't the worst thing about your diagnosis. The worst thing is that gay people believe it. Nothing makes you sick like believing that you're sick. Take the damning label of sickness away from us. Take us out of your nomenclature. Work for repeal of the sodomy laws, for civil rights protections for gay people. Most important of all, speak out. You've allowed a handful of homophobes to tell the public what you think. It's up to you now to get on the late-night talk shows and write for the news weeklies as they do. You've got to tell the world what you believe, that gay is good.
Ron Gold's plain-spoken, proud, defiant speech brought the voice of gay liberation to the APA debate stage. 7 months after that speech in Honolulu, 4.5 years after the Stonewall Uprising, 10 years after Frank Kameny turned his attention to the psychiatrists, 16 years after Dr. Hooker presented her landmark study in Chicago, and 23 years after the Mattachine Society was founded, the American Psychiatric Association changed its guidelines in the DSM and, with a stroke of a pen, cured millions of gay people who are no longer ipso facto mentally ill.
What of the people who say, and I've had this said to me, that the only reason the psychiatrists made the change was that they were strong-armed by a bunch of gay activists, and in fact, it wasn't a true assessment of the feelings of the psychiatrists, that they were forced into doing it?
I wouldn't say that's a fair assessment. I do think that we raised the issue publicly within the association. Frank and I did it, and then others joined us and also did it. If we hadn't made some noises, I think it would still be locked in committee. I think we moved its work much faster and much further. I would not say it's fair. It's not fair to say that we strong-armed them. That's not fair to the psychiatrists. They are not going to be strong-armed into something.
No,
but if they know, if they
radical chic, and you could get a certain, you could get ahead by a certain radical tactic.
But not when it came to making basic decisions like the Board of Trustees vote to remove us from the DSM manual.
They're never totally immune to.
I think what really happened is that they knew they were wrong. In their hearts, they knew that this was not right and not fair, and that they, sooner or later, they would have to abandon the old position on homosexuality. And they might as well do it sooner rather than later, because then each revision of the DSM there was about a 10-year gap. And they could, I don't suppose they cared for the prospect of the nip-ups that we'd be doing if they didn't, the nip-ups.
What is that?
Nip-ups, antics, zap tactics, and whatever else we might be doing to move them along on the issue. I'm not. I don't have any qualms about raising the issue. I don't think it was too much, and I don't think you can say that they were pressured into doing something they would. If they knew it was really wrong, they wouldn't have budged. But I think they knew their position was wrong and that they would have to be budged. And maybe this was an easy way out.
But it's always been more of a political decision than
A medical one. It never was a medical one. And that's why I think the action came so fast. After all, it was only 3 years from the time that feminists and gays first zapped the APA at a behavior therapy session to the time that the Board of Trustees voted to approve removing homosexuality from the list of disorders, mental disorders. And it was a political move. Sure, it was that, but that's because it was a political move all along. It never was a scientific statement to label us sick.
I think the psychiatrists were losing ground on a number of fronts, and I think they just didn't want to be left behind.
Some psychiatrists didn't mind being left behind. There were still holdouts firmly opposed to the reclassification. After the December 15th decision, a group of psychiatrists insisted on putting the nomenclature change to a vote by the whole membership of the APA. It was unprecedented, and it didn't work. The vote affirmed the trustees' decision to pass the December 1973 resolution that removed homosexuality from the list of mental illnesses.
Sizzle Moon song, I'm going to have to do more research on that because I'm looking at what you're talking about here. What are your thoughts on that? If you're still here, y'all go ahead and continue to listen. Then we got one more video, y'all. We gonna be here for a minute because again, we're sharing queer history that a lot of us as queer people don't even know. The first video I showed, or shared with y'all, shall I say, not showed, but shared, is the fact that, again, they were demonizing adult queer people, literally torturing them and putting them through all type of bizarre-ass experiments and shit. Meanwhile, telling the youth, who may be queer, some of them, not all, but some of them, that if you do any of this, this is what's going to happen to you. And me growing up in the 90s and hearing about queer people and all the demonizing stuff about them, and then me realizing that I was one of them because I was queer, what do you think that did to a child's psyche? But anyway, let's continue.
Act 6, Vanishing Point. It's interesting in historical perspectives how some events get bigger the further you get away from them, and some kind of shrink. Delisting homosexuality had a fundamental effect on the movement for LGBTQ rights. Dozens of struggles and victories depended on us no longer being automatically dismissed as mentally ill or tortured for it. But even when I was interviewing Barbara and Kay back in 1989, we had a sense that later generations might not understand what a seismic change reclassification had been.
The difference that it made was it took an enormous burden of operation off our backs so that we could stop throwing so much of our resource into fighting the sickness label and could now devote some of that energy and money to other issues that were really big and really hurting. The effects were not necessarily felt overnight, but you could see that by the end of the 70s, some 6 or 7 years after the decision in APA, we were no longer putting so much energy into fighting the psychiatrists and the sickness label.
And today it's
hardly talked about. Now it's okay. I'd rather. No, but I would. In a way, you can argue with people who say that you're immoral because you can say, look, there's so many kinds of morality. There are no absolutes. And you and I will agree on most things, and we will disagree on this one, but you can't enforce your morality on me. The sickness label supposedly had the cachet of indisputable science, which made it a lot harder to deal with with the general public. It was easy for people to say, oh, those people are sick. And now they had to come up with other reasons. And now they're coming out with more basic reasons. I don't like you. I don't like the way you live. I think you're immoral. I think you're rotten. Well, all of that is more honest than this nonsense about you're sick.
That's right. That's right. It's forced people to be more honest.
Exactly.
It's been a half-century since the American Psychiatric Association decided that homosexuality was not a mental illness. But that reality hasn't entirely lifted the burden for many LGBTQ young people coming of age today. They still suffer in a society that stigmatizes people because of their sexuality or their gender identity, when who they are doesn't align with the heterosexual and gender binary norm. That's where we'll pick up the conversation in our next and final episode in this mini-season, when I sit down with mental health experts to ask them about the legacy of the sickness label, the mental health challenges facing LGBTQ people today, and we'll also talk about hopeful futures for LGBTQ youth.
And again, you can listen to this, and I encourage all queer people, please make sure that you subscribe to, what is it called again? Hold on, what's it called? It's called Making Gay History. It gives you information that we, especially me as a queer person growing up, didn't have. It took me being in my 30s for me to learn more about queer history. But see, do you not understand the onslaught? That's why I showed y'all all the shit in the last live about Christian nationalism and how at this point the people behind the scenes with the money basically are saying, well, if you want something done right, you have to do it yourself. Because now they want to make sure that queer people don't have any sense of foundation to build upon in reference to their humanity. Because you have people now that are connected to JD Vance. Again, we read it and looked at a little bit of videos about it yesterday, that literally want to execute heretics, execute people who do not believe what they believe. Queer people not out here unaliving other people because they don't agree with us. We're not the one running up in churches and shooting up churches. We're not the one going into supermarkets, shooting shit up. But we have so much overwhelming amount of evidence from the past and definitely in the present, and definitely what y'all telling us, what y'all gonna do to us in the future, of y'all being violent to us, y'all demonizing us, y'all labeling us, and that even if we stand the fuck up for ourselves, the narrative's already been created and controlled to where don't listen to those people. They're the crazy mentally ill ones. Meanwhile, especially to the black community, Bayard Rustin was amazing to the black community. James Baldwin, that another man quoted on a red pill platform, benefited the black community. Langston Hughes benefited the black community. The black homosexuals and the faggots that y'all like talking about benefit your churches. Y'all probably wouldn't have as much creative shit that y'all have to enjoy in this world today if it wasn't for the homosexuals. But we got one more video. Read y'all comments real quick. And shout out to Sizzle Moon Song, new subscriber. Shout out to you. This is the time to come together. If y'all can, please make, and I really don't ask y'all to do this, and thank you, Queen, Marsha P. Johnson, a black trans woman that was one of the prominent faces of Stonewall. But I'm gonna ask y'all to share my content, because it's time to come together. And again, it's so sad because here we are keeping this cycle going, and the powers that be are making money off of all this shit. All this shit. If they keep making money off of us, it's our fault. But don't worry, this election gonna be the wake-up call, because 2020 wasn't it. But this shit going forward, oh baby. Rawan says, I was watching a video of a boy about to get a kiss from his dad, black, and the boy told his dad, we don't kiss boys. And everybody laughing, and the comments saying, good, don't teach illness. This has forever been something that straight people have labeled this way. So videos like this are so important. They don't care about history. So a Moon Song says, I'ma fuck that word up. Madasheen, I messed it up. If I did, charged in my head, not my heart, was a real force to be recognized and reckoned with. We all have Harry Hay to thank for our freedoms. May he rest in power. The APA's resolution stated that homosexuality was not a mental illness and that people who identified as homosexual should not be labeled as sick. The APA also supported civil rights legislation that this white Christian nationalism is getting ready to remove all that shit. Never give up. Never give in. Never let them force us back into the closet. And even though I said white Christian nationalism, I understand that there are people of different shades, hues, ethnicities that care about, overall, most importantly, the human family. And those who care about the human family, I am cool with and I rock with, no matter what color your skin is, your orientation, your gender expression identity, your ethnicity, your beliefs, your culture, doesn't matter. As long as we can learn from each other and love on each other and stand with each other, that's all that matters to me. You say Tika chicken, leave me alone. All right, y'all, let's get into the last video, where we're gonna bring it to the present moment. And most importantly, the one thing, okay, that people love to throw in queer people's face all the damn time. The children, the children, the children. What about the children? Y'all gonna push the illness on the children. Oh my God, my children done saw it and now they gonna be ill and shit like that. Yes, let's talk about the children, but what about the queer children? I don't know if y'all have amnesia or something, but let's not forget that when y'all were young children, y'all also had queer peers your age as well. It's just at a young age, society indoctrinated you on how to treat them. And then that'd be so funny because a lot of these children who end up teaching to hate people and shit like that, as they get older and their hormones start raging, baby. And y'all wonder why the DL culture is about to really be on the rise. So again, for the women out there that believe it's Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, well, when Adam and Steve is busting all type of nuts in your bed, when you walk in from work, or walk in from dropping the children off, or walk in from doing an errand or something, or you look at your husband's phone and see a big old throbbing dick on the screen, I don't want to hear shit, because JD Van's gonna tell you to stay in that relationship. Make it work. But let's get into it. Okay? Learn more about Harry Hay. Kicked him out because he was too radical. Okay. I'ma definitely have to do my research. Thank you for that. And again, make sure y'all subscribe to I keep fucking up the name, y'all. I thought I had it, girl. I gotta pull it up again. Making Gay History. Make sure you subscribe to that and educate yourself. Learn as much as you can before they start removing this shit. I'm gonna tell you right now, all this gay shit, and probably even some of my shit, they gonna try to scrub this shit from the internet. Even though nothing is ever fully removed from the internet, but still. All right, let's get it, y'all.
Welcome back to our Making Gay History miniseries, Dismantling a Diagnosis. I'm Eric Marcus. 50 years after the American Psychiatric Association voted to remove homosexuality from its list of mental disorders in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, we've been looking back at what that change meant. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about the current realities of mental health for LGBTQ people. I was 15 at the time of the vote in 1973 and just coming into an understanding of my own sexuality. I wasn't aware the vote had happened. It didn't filter down to Kew Gardens in Queens. All I knew was that what I was feeling was wrong, according to every signal and message I'd received from the world around me. When I began researching homosexuality for my freshman year sociology paper, many of the awful books that were on the shelves when Barbara Giddings, Kay Lahusen, and Frank Kameny entered the battle with the APA were still there, and I found them horrifying. There were also a handful of books that reflected the change to the DSM, and others that simply assumed it and moved on from there. When I wrote the paper, Marginal Men, the Homosexual and the Alcoholic, the language I used echoed so much of the literature of the recent past. LGBTQ people as inverts, with arrested development, maladjusted. The language has moved on since then. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders has been revised many times since then, but the harmful effects of stigma have been long-lasting and remain profound. 50 years after 1973's reclassification, we wanted to open up a conversation on making gay history about mental health today in our LGBTQ communities. And to do that, I'm joined by a couple of leaders in the field. Dr. Laura Erickson Schroth, she/they, is a psychiatrist committed to improving mental health through education and resource creation. She is the Chief Medical Officer at the JED Foundation, a nonprofit focused on emotional health and suicide prevention for teens and young adults. Laura has provided thousands of patients with crisis intervention and mental health support in over 10 different emergency rooms in New York City. Much of her career is focused on LGBTQ mental health, and she continues to see clients at Hetrick Martin Institute for LGBTQIA+ youth. Laura is the editor of Trans Bodies, Trans Selves, a resource guide written by and for trans communities. Dr. Elon H. Meyer is the Williams Distinguished Senior Scholar for Public Policy at the Williams Institute and Professor Emeritus of Sociomedical Sciences at Columbia University. Meyer is the principal investigator of the Generation Study, a U.S. national probability study of stress, identity, health, and healthcare utilization across the 3 cohorts of sexual minorities, and TransPop, the first national probability sample of transgender individuals in the U.S. Welcome both. Thanks so much for joining me. Laura, how far has psychiatry come in relation to homosexuality since the DSM-3 in 1973?
Well, thanks so much, first of all, for having me on the show. You know, I think there are some ways that psychiatry has changed quite a lot, and there's still a long way that we have to go. I think it's been a really big turning point to see the field go from thinking about queer and trans people as inherently pathological to the idea that society's treatment of LGBTQ people is what damages their mental health. And that's what Dr. Meyer articulates in his minority stress theory, which I think has been really useful to the field. And I think that understanding started a lot earlier than we sometimes talk about. You know, it started to permeate the American public in the 40s and the 50s with the Kinsey reports, you know, finding that same-sex attraction and sexuality were more common than people thought. And then in the late 50s, there was a psychologist named Evelyn Hooker who published a study where she compared gay and straight men on a series of projective tests like the Rorschach. And she had blinded reviewers rate participants' overall adjustment, and she found that it was the same for gay and for straight men, and that the reviewers couldn't tell any better than by chance which of the tests were from gay men or straight men. And so I think that kind of work was really setting the stage for change. But I think it's actually important to remember that trans people are still pathologized in the DSM. You know, if we look back at the DSM, initially there was no mention of gender-related diagnoses in the DSM-1, but in the DSM-2, in 1968, we saw the introduction of the diagnosis of transvestism. And then when the DSM-3 came along in 1980, it introduced the category gender identity disorders. And because this was the first new edition of the DSM since the vote to remove homosexuality, some people have speculated that that was kind of a backdoor strategy to allow for the continued use of conversion therapy on gay people, especially teenagers, because the new criteria were kind of broad enough to include young people who had attitudes or behaviors that were outside those that were expected for their gender roles. And I think it was also an interesting time to be including a new diagnosis of this type, because the DSM-3 was also supposed to be a move towards kind of more rigorous empirical evidence for disorders, but the gender identity categories didn't seem to have to go through that same process. So if we follow it forward in the DSM-4, they carried over similar diagnoses, you know, gender identity disorder, and then there was more controversy as the DSM-5 was being planned. And in the end, the DSM-5 includes this diagnosis of gender dysphoria, which to me is pretty similar to the approach the DSM took with ego-dystonic homosexuality. The idea is that being trans itself doesn't qualify someone as having a disorder, but it's their discomfort with it, the dysphoria that it causes. And I think the same way that it did with ego dystonic homosexuality, that put the onus on the individual, rather than society for causing that dysphoria. It's really hard not to have dysphoria about being trans if you're living in a society that tells you every day that being trans is wrong. So I think there are so many, ways that we continue to use the gender dysphoria diagnosis that are really harmful to trans communities, that distance trans communities from psychiatrists and from mental health providers. And the takeaway for me is that in psychiatry and in all of medicine, it's a product of people, right? The DSM was created through expert consensus. It's always going to carry with it these sort of social biases that permeate society. And that's why we need to change the way society thinks about queer and trans people, which I think is actually happening.
Mm-hmm. And I really want to talk more about the pathologizing of some gender identities in this conversation. But first, I'm going to ask Ilan, as Laura, you've just raised, there's this really important distinction that having a mental disorder is something quite different from being a mental disorder. And it sounds obvious in a way, but Ilan, can you explain why some people lost sight of this distinction in the efforts to delist homosexuality as a disorder?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me, Eric. I think that's a really important distinction that somehow got lost. And when I started working on this issues many years ago in the 90s, I realized, wait a second, all the debate was, do LGBT people have more or less disorders than straight cisgender people? And that really says nothing about whether homosexuality itself should be a disorder, any more than if I said to you that women have more depression, that means that being a woman is a disorder. And as I realized, I thought it was like a brilliant observation on my part, but then I read further and realized that Judd Marmor, who was the head of the American Psychiatric Association at the time, made that point quite clearly and argued that it has nothing to do with whether we should include homosexuality as a mental disorder. And I think that heritage of trying to defend LGBT people from stigma by removing homosexuality from DSM-2 led to years, really, all the way through my schooling, of having the statement everywhere, gay people are not more mentally disordered than straight people, and honestly led to us ignoring some of the issues that now, thankfully, we are dealing with. And what happened in the time in between this, after the removal of homosexuality, as Laura mentioned, my model of minority stress has really tried to change the focus from looking at what's wrong with the person to looking at what's wrong with the environment. Again, that wasn't my invention in the sense of kind of being this shift. This was a shift that came with stress research, which really started after World War II, where people began to observe, especially the harms of war, and change from the more psychoanalytic theory that predated World War II as the primary way of explaining mental health, which was focused on within the person, anxieties and conflicts and etc., to thinking at what the environment is doing. So what my minority stress work has done is basically say, look at stigma and prejudice and look at how it exposes LGBT people to excess stress. And if we agree, as research has shown, that stress can lead to diseases, certain diseases, especially mental health, then there would be no surprise that LGBT people would have more mental disorder. And even that, when I started writing, was controversial because people said, oh, you're airing problems in public that can damage and actually further stigmatize LGBT people, which of course I didn't agree with. I thought we need to actually address the stressors, the stigma and prejudice, and their mental health impact. And it was not until about 2000 and after that really 1999 was the first major paper that showed health disparities. And at the same time, Healthy People 2010 was being written and showed a focus on health disparities, which we now accept and recognize. And what health disparities says is there are disparities in health and mental health that are caused by social conditions and situations in the environment, which is going back to where we started. It is not the LGBT person's fault that they are experiencing depression, that they're thinking about suicide. It is stigma and prejudice that is perpetrated by society.
It makes so much sense to me. One of the things I was aware of early on in terms of statistics was that gay and lesbian people, and this is back to when I was first looking at gay and lesbian people, we weren't LGBTQ people yet, that we have such higher rates of drinking, of alcoholism and smoking, because it's stressful.
And let's talk about that real quick. A lot of people say, oh, well, gay people, y'all just so sexual, and then y'all be getting drunk and all this other type of stuff. Yeah, because when you're dealing with stress, unfortunately, those are some of the ways, if used in an unhealthy way, that can fuck you up. It's a means of escape. A lot of people have sex to feel something or to not feel anything. A lot of people get drunk to escape their problems, only for their problems to be more intensified when they do come back from being drunk. Same thing with drugs, all that type of stuff. Maybe if they had people to talk to that could validate them, that can learn from them, that can listen to them, and in some areas, if they needed, be able to help them, they wouldn't have to self-medicate so much. Imagine living in a world, y'all, where everything about you is demon, 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 devil, 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 Satan, Satan, Lucifer, Lucifer, evil, 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 Baphomet, 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 abomination, abomination, sinner, 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 sinner. You're hearing this all the time. It being reinforced from family members, from friends, from motherfuckers who are strangers, people that you don't even know. Having the right to tell you that, and then most importantly, that God sees all of that and he really hates it. And that if you try to change, here is what you have to go through in order to possibly change. Be castrated, which is not a guarantee. Aversion therapy. So you take medicine that makes you sick as fucking nauseous as you watch same-sex material in order to acclimate your brain to seeing something gay and being actually disgusted and sick from it. Lobotomies and shit. Electroshock therapy that would have people convulse and scream and yell and cry and projectile vomit and shit. So yes, a lot of people chose to fuck in order to relieve some damn stress. Yes, some people down fucking alcohol and beer and shit to escape their stress. Yes, people take all type of drugs and shit to escape their stress. And then for some, that when all that doesn't work, the sweet release of death seems to be the option. And the fucking sad part is that these individuals are moving again from adults down to teenagers. And my YouTube channel has the motherfucking proof. I ain't got to lie. Sizzle Moonsaw says, true. Imagine that growing up in the South in a Southern Baptist environment, 10 times worse. And now for these next 4 years, it's gonna be Southern Baptist shit all over America.
I think of the levels of anxiety I experienced around being a closeted gay kid, and then when I came out, even going to the grocery store with my partner, worrying that someone's going to ask us if we're brothers or what. So it makes it so obvious but it wasn't so obvious. So, Laura, our series so far is focused on gay men and lesbians because that was the focus of the fight for reclassification in 1973. But for trans and gender nonconforming folks, there is also a complicated history with the DSM that you talked about a bit at the start of this conversation. But has psychiatry been friend or foe to trans folks, and is the field moving in the right direction?
Yeah, I think the short answer is it is moving in the right direction, but as I said, I think there's a lot of room for improvement. I think, one of those is obviously, to me, taking gender-related diagnoses out of the DSM. I think we're at a turning point, the way that we were with ego-dystonic homosexuality, where relatively soon this is going to be a thing of the past. I've seen some really major changes in the approaches within the psychiatric community to trans clients, and I think some of them have to do with work being done within psychiatric communities, and some of them sort of just happened based on other societal changes or changes within the medical system. So one example is the informed consent model for access to hormones for trans adults. That didn't come from within psychiatry, but it's really affected the way psychiatrists work with trans clients. So when gender-related care moved out of academic institutions and into community health centers, mostly because academic centers were shutting down their work in this area, community health centers were taking over the work and changing the approaches. Informed consent is the idea that people have the ability to make choices for themselves about their medical care and should be given the options and educated about the risks and the benefits instead of providers choosing what options are available to them, which was what was happening for trans people before that. And now informed consent has become the norm for adult hormone prescriptions in community health centers across the United States. And it's such a step forward. Trans people used to have to perform for their doctors to convince them they were really trans. Sometimes that meant lying about things like their sexual attractions, because if you transitioned, you were supposed to be straight in the gender that you transitioned to. And now there are many different groups that are moving farther toward informed consent models. So the World Professional Association for Transgender Health puts out standards of care, and those have changed so that there are no longer requirements for trans people, things like living full-time as someone's gender that they identify with before they have hormones or surgery if they want those. And that requirement used to cause real distress for people. And psychiatrists weren't necessarily the ones who pushed for informed consent models, but they've made a really big impact on the way psychiatrists relate to trans clients. At least for hormone therapy, they're no longer in the role of gatekeepers to the care, which opens up much more space for kind of genuine connection. And I think the same thing is happening for surgery. It's a lot slower. But along with informed consent, this other leap forward in this kind of relationship has been moving to capacity evaluations for gender-affirming surgeries. And the old model was basically evaluating whether the psychiatrist thought someone was trans and should be able to have a surgery. Now, many psychiatrists approach evaluations for gender-affirming surgeries the same way they do evaluations for any other type of surgical procedure for anyone. They use certain criteria to determine what we call capacity to make a medical decision. And in most cases, adults do have the capacity to make decisions for themselves about their medical care, as long as they're thinking properly, there's nothing going on like an acute medical illness that is causing difficulty with that, or dementia or something like that. And so moving to using that same criteria for gender-affirming surgeries is a really important shift from my standpoint. And then I would say one last thing in this area is that there are more queer and trans people entering the field of psychiatry. There have always been groups of queer and trans people in psychiatry, but initially they had to be underground. And for many years, it was really hard to be out. That's why you see the examples of things like Dr. Anonymous, speaking at the APA convention about what it was like to be a gay psychiatrist at the time. He was worried about losing his job if people knew that he was gay. And one organization that's been really important historically to support queer and trans psychiatrists is called AGLP, which is the Association of LGBTQ Psychiatrists. And it started in the 1960s when LGBTQ members of the APA met secretly at the annual meetings.
Yeah, it was called the Gay PA.
The Gay PA,
yes.
That's right. And we sometimes still call it that, you know? And that organization now is this really robust group of psychiatrists that are doing all this advocacy and educational work. They run meetings and sessions. They have a free online curriculum for psychiatry residents. So I think it's exciting to see this next generation of queer and trans psychiatrists moving into this space.
As a follow-up, Laura, I just want to ask you, as a clinician, when we talk about minority stress, how have you seen that showing up in your work?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question. So my clinical work currently is at a place called Hetrick Martin Institute for LGBTQ Health, and I've been there part-time for about 8 years now. And I would say that the majority of the young people that I see at Hetrick Martin are living with that sort of legacy of minority stress. So the most common diagnosis for me for the young people that I see there is PTSD. Many of the young people that I work with have really significant histories of chronic trauma that have led to difficulties with interpersonal relationships, with trust, feelings of abandonment and rejection sensitivity, things like that, because they've experienced violations of their trust and felt rejected by their families, by society. Many of them are in youth shelters in New York City. So, you know, I think that it's really important to talk about how minority stress actively affects people right now, here and now, and not to forget that continues to happen.
Laura, I interviewed both Damian Martin and Emery Hetrick, the co-founders.
Oh, that's so
and Joyce
cool.
Hunter, who was one of the first counselors working with Hetrick Martin.
I know Joyce, yeah.
Yeah, so I just wonder what Damian and Emery would think of how things have evolved and the fact that people have so benefited, especially given that when Hetrick Martin was founded, it was a time when people were terrified of working, well, gay people were terrified of working with young people because we were afraid of being accused of being, well, in the old days, pederasts and recruiters, and now groomers.
It ain't
and I wonder,
it ain't just in the old days, baby. Again, that's what they say all the motherfucking time about us. Make sure your kids ain't around. Make sure I feel like I shouldn't have to tell my child and explain to my child. No matter what. That's why I be telling y'all they want to get rid of queerness altogether. So much to the point to where now Christian nationalism is going to attempt to do what they believe God would want them to do, which is to completely eradicate. That shit is cool. Wow.
Still an issue that you find people in your profession are at all nervous working with young people.
I do think that comes up, especially in youth services, and I don't think it's specific to mental health providers. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of especially gay men working with young people in LGBTQ youth services worry about that. It's a little bit less of a worry, I think, for queer women working in those spaces, though it's not, it's not off the table to worry about that. But I do think that that's been passed along through generations, that worry.
Elon, earlier this year, we released our season about coming of age during the 1970s, and someone we heard quite a lot from was Dr. George Weinberg. He was the psychologist who first coined the term homophobia. What is homophobia, and what are its effects on mental health?
The term homophobia has been subject to all kinds of criticism and debate, and I feel that before I even get into it, I feel like this debate is a little bit too much in the weeds and ignoring the fact that it's a term that is very well known, used in newspapers. So I go with the term homophobia. Some people say, well, it's not a phobia, and have all kinds of objections to the term. They have other terms. I think of homophobia as akin to sexism, to racism, basically the attitude and the belief that homosexuality or being LGBT. Well, of course, we differentiate between homophobia and transphobia, which are similar terms, but in general, homophobia and transphobia are attitudes, beliefs against LGBT people, stereotypes about them, and basically that's the definition of prejudice and stigma about LGBT people. So when we say homophobia, I think what we mean is negative, hostile attitudes and beliefs and policies that stem from those attitudes.
There seems to be this tension then, from what we've been talking about, between diagnoses as a way of accessing treatment, but then also as ways of stigmatizing, even oppressing people, pathologizing some things rather than others as a mode of oppression. How do you think about that tension in the work you do? And am I wrong in thinking that some medicalization may be driven in efforts to qualify people for treatments or insurance? I'm thinking of my own therapist and discussions we had, my former therapist, I should say, when my insurance provider came back with a list of questions if they were going to continue covering me, and they were only going to continue covering me if there was the threat of suicide involved, that I was in danger of killing myself. So we had these discussions. Do you want me to write that, that this is a possibility, that you have suicidal ideation, which I don't, but that would have meant losing my coverage for my insurance, which is crazy. Laura, can you take a stab at answering that first?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most obvious problem here, the elephant in the room, is that we're, using insurance and coverage of medical care in a financial way to determine how we carry out that care. So, we have labels for diagnoses mostly now because that's how we bill. That's how we get reimbursed. And that's what's leading the way that we, do care in a lot of ways, including in the example that you just gave. I think maybe it's helpful to talk a little bit about gender dysphoria and some of the arguments around that and how they relate to accessing care. Looking into how the gender dysphoria diagnosis is being used now, where it's used actually most often is by mental health providers writing letters for people for surgeries. So the surgeon will require a letter or 2 letters, depending on what the surgery is, to be written by the mental health provider and to say explicitly that the person meets criteria for gender dysphoria. And so you wonder, where does that come from? Did the surgeon come up with that, or did a group of surgeons come up with it? And they didn't. It's insurance companies that are requiring that. And that goes back to how our guidelines are written. So some insurance companies create their guidelines based on the WPATH standards of care. Others create their guidelines internally by deciding what they think is appropriate or that they should need. And so it's interesting to see how this cascades. So you go from insurance companies requiring something in particular to then surgeons needing to ask for it from a different group of healthcare providers. And then we have, mental health providers using a diagnosis that, they mostly don't use on their own. Mostly when they see trans and non-binary clients, they're using things like adjustment disorder if they're going through a transition in their life, or the diagnoses that they actually have. Maybe they have major depressive disorder or generalized anxiety disorder or PTSD or whatever it is. Interestingly, the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases from the World Health Organization, has gone in a different direction, and I think it's the direction that we should be going in. So the ICD-11, which was released in 2019, took gender-related diagnoses out of the behavioral section and put them in something called conditions related to sexual health. And that to me was depathologizing, because it was putting them in a medical section for billing purposes. And in the ICD, it's called gender incongruence. And this has been accepted by the WHO Assembly. It went into effect at the beginning of 2022. Now the US is a little bit behind. So we're still using ICD-10, which was made available in 1990 and first used in other countries in 94, but it wasn't implemented in the United States until 2013.
Sounds like a mess. Ilan, did you want to take a stab at that?
Well, I'll just add, I think that the problem that you're raising is really not a psychiatry problem or a medical problem. It's really an insurance system problem that we have in the United States, and it's absolutely ridiculous. And we don't provide mental health services. There's no parity that have been promised for decades, for good and for bad. Psychiatrists and other mental health or even healthcare providers have to use diagnosis to justify treatment, as you described with your therapist, Eric, and it constrains us, but it also adds to stigma and adds to difficulties of receiving care, as Laura mentioned, and regarding gender. I would also add to the issues that Laura raised regarding the need for diagnosis, prisons, and for transgender people in prison, it's not going to be a consent issue. It's going to be you have a medical diagnosis and therefore the prison is required to provide you services, which is of course not yet settled everywhere in the United States, but here in California, prisons are reluctantly sometimes providing care, but the whole issue of diagnosis becomes an important part of the care delivery, and sometimes, many times, to the disadvantage of the patient who needs the service.
Yeah. So these insurance problems become medical problems because they become access problems. Do you think that contributes to some of the disparities you've been talking about, Ilan?
I mean, I don't have any evidence specifically on how the insurance, this whole chain of connections that you just allude to work in terms of increasing health disparities. LGBT people actually do use health services more than cisgender heterosexual people, probably because they need it more, because they have more health issues because of the health disparities. So they do have access to care, especially since Obamacare. There is pretty good access, but we find, again, especially with transgender individuals, that there's access to care, not necessarily access to quality care or care of professionals who are knowledgeable about the issues. So that transgender people report that the healthcare provider is not well versed in the issues, and they often have to train the healthcare provider so that they can receive care. So that's one big issue, and we can talk about medical training and how much medical schools spend on LGBT issues, which is very little, if at all. For LGBT people, we did find that, especially when it relates to mental health services, and for men, things related to sexual transmitted diseases, like they prefer a LGBT provider. So that's another element of adding to disparities if you cannot find quality care, or if you don't find care from a person that you can trust, even if a straight cisgender provider may be very well qualified. If a LGBT person is more comfortable with an LGBT service provider, that becomes an obstacle to service.
Laura?
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that, like Ilan is saying, there are so many barriers to care for LGBTQ people across the spectrum, and particularly for trans people who may have to come into contact with medical systems more often. So there's everything from what you were talking about, every step of the way, insurance barriers that come from, lower levels of employment, that come from societal discrimination, right? And then, not being able to find people who know about what's going on with you and have treated anyone else like you, being able to find people who you trust and feel safe with. A lot of trans people avoid care. And so if you look at studies, you can see that, high numbers say that they won't, for example, go into emergency rooms when they're experiencing something that really you should go to the emergency room for, because they're worried about the way that they're going to be treated. And I think that it's realistic to be worried about the way that you're going to be treated, because when you look at studies of the kinds of experiences people have had, a lot of them are very negative. I mean, people have even been assaulted in emergency rooms, in hospitals, in clinics. And certainly, even if things are not to that level of being assaulted, the way that people are treated, the language that's used around them and about them, the way that, medical students and other students will be brought in to sort of meet this, special type of case of person. You just want to be treated like a normal person. So within trans communities, there's something called the trans broken arm syndrome, which basically is the idea that if you go into an emergency room as a trans person and you have a broken arm, they'll find pretty much anything else to say that is going on with you, when really all you have is a broken arm. And so, sort of everything gets attributed to your trans identity. They want to know, what organs you have. They want to know what hormones you're on. And some of these things are important for certain medical diagnoses to figure out what's going on with someone. And some of them are not important. If it's just your arm got hit and now it hurts, you don't need to know every detail of someone's medical history.
So, Ilan, we've been talking about where we find ourselves today in light of the past 50 years or so in psychiatry and the LGBTQ civil rights movement. But I'm going to go way further back to Germany in 1897, when Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld founded the Humanitarian Scientific Committee, whose slogan was "Justice through Science." First, can you talk about your connection to Dr. Hirschfeld? And I only discovered this over lunch with you and your husband in Berlin when we were all there for Magnus Hirschfeld's 150th birthday. And just as an aside, I urge listeners to go back and listen to our episode on Dr. Hirschfeld if you haven't heard it yet. We'll be linking to that episode in the show notes. So, Ilan, this connection to the absolute beginning.
Yeah, I mean, that is actually been a discovery that I made while I was still a student, I think in the early 90s. My father was born in Berlin and left just before the war, after the Nazis came into the power, so our family is kind of spread all over the world. And a family member from Australia mentioned something like, "Oh, I don't know if you know, but we're related to Magnus Hirschfeld." But of course, I completely jumped in joy and disbelief. But my father's mother family is related to Hirschfeld's family. He has several sisters. And I won't get into the exact family tree because it's a little complicated, but of course it's a great pride for me to have any association with him. As you mentioned, and Laura mentioned before, like there have been a lot of gay affirmative work in the United States, maybe 40s even, but in Germany, as you said, Magnus Hirschfeld, who was a medical doctor, had an incredibly LGBT affirmative clinic and writings. It's interesting to me and maybe to us today that his first cases that prompted him to pay attention to LGBT people at the time was the suicide rates that he observed. Many of them were related to blackmailing, but of course related to the stigma and prejudice that somebody who was exposed as a gay or having same-sex relations at the time was completely destroyed. And one more interesting thing about Hirschfeld is he talked about the third sex as a way of thinking about LGBT people. So the distinctions between LGBT and transgender people weren't as pronounced as we tend to see them now. His clinic included many transgender people, maybe even cross-dressing people, as well as LGBT people who are cisgender. And he advocated for the rights of LGBT people in Germany, trying to overturn an anti-gay bill that he saw as one of the causes of the blackmails, and therefore the suicide. So he made the same connections that basically I wrote about kind of later as minority stress between stigma, prejudice, pressures on LGBT people and their health.
I love that connection. It's just you couldn't, if this were a novel, no one would believe it. But also of note regarding Dr. Hirschfeld, he and his institute were one of the first targets of the Nazis. Hitler attacked Hirschfeld as early as the 1920s. So the kinds of attacks we see now 100 years later, have precedence.
And Eric, if I may add, like some of the attacks involved the burning of the institute, the burning of the materials and books and records that were in it. And some of the most famous photos that we see of the burning of books in Berlin by the Nazis and by youth students at the university there, those are pictures actually that of the institute, or the Sexual Research Institute, that was destroyed at the same time. And luckily for him, Herzl was out of the country at the time, so he survived it, but was never able to return to Berlin.
You know, in fact, I visited the site of where his institute was. It's a park. There's no building there anymore. Laura, when I was writing this script, I initially described my sexuality as immutable, and I've often quipped that I'm a Kinsey 6+. But what do we understand now about sexuality and gender identities that is maybe less rigid than the language of "born this way" implies?
Yeah, I think some of the language that we use to make arguments that being gay isn't pathological did really lean into this idea that it's not your fault if you're gay. And so that's sort of what's been in the atmosphere for the last couple of decades. You know, I think that view was especially popular in the late 90s, the early 2000s. There was the hunt for the gay gene, if you remember it. I think it was, on the cover of magazines. And during that time, there were all kinds of what they called, quote, biological studies, of gay identity, of trans identity, studies that were comparing identical twins on their sexual orientations or gender identity. There were brain scans. There were these studies looking at genes, theories about prenatal hormones, or I don't know if you two remember the proxy markers that were being used to demonstrate the exposure to different hormone levels in utero. So if your index finger and your middle finger are a certain ratio, then you're gay. And yeah. And these were all sort of aiming to show that LGBTQ people couldn't help being who they were because, it was, quote, biological. And I think that really was something that a lot of queer and trans people stood behind for a while there, because when it's one of the only arguments that's working with people who are initially sort of against your identity, you can see how that would be something that people would rally behind. I recently participated in a review article with some colleagues, so Rachel Levin out at Pomona and Cale Edmiston in Pittsburgh and Christy Mack, and we looked at all the studies that have been done attempting to link trans identity to sort of, quote, biological causes. And there's really not much there, at least right now. It looks like from everything that we know, if you're going to piece it all together, it's probably something like a biopsychosocial model where there's a biological contribution to gender identity and sexual orientation, but it certainly isn't as simple as we're all born this way. And I think the problem is that the argument often works. Like I said, it gets people who aren't on your side. I have a favorite quote from John D'Amelio's essay, Capitalism and Gay Identity. And he says, lesbian and gay identity and communities are historically created. We're not a fixed social minority composed for all time of a certain percentage of the population. Claims made by gays and non-gays that sexual orientation is fixed at a certain age, that large numbers of visible gay men and lesbians in society, the media, schools, will have no influence on the sexual identities of the young are wrong. And to be sure, this argument confirms the worst fears and the most rabid rhetoric of our political opponents. But our response must be to challenge the underlying belief that homosexual relations are a bad, poor second choice. We must not slip into the opportunistic defense that society need not worry about tolerating us since only homosexuals become homosexuals. At best, a minority group analysis and a civil rights strategy pertain to those of us who are already gay. It leaves today's youth, tomorrow's lesbians and gay men, to internalize heterosexist models that it can take a lifetime to expunge.
Yep, we are way more complicated than I liked it. It was so simple when I was young, but it didn't match who we are as humans. So to both of you, I have a final question. I'm not young anymore. Just got my Medicare card. Nice thing to have. But one of the great privileges of hosting this podcast and doing the work that I do is that it puts me in touch with many, many young people through our work in education and through all the emails and messages we receive. And while so much of our work focuses on the progress we made, we tell the stories of the wins, of what activists achieved and what previous generations survived. I'm also so conscious that young people are facing so many challenges on many fronts, and we're having to fight some similar battles again and some new ones. The U.S. Supreme Court just tossed out a case arguing that conversion therapy bans are an unwarranted limit on free speech. The wedding website case opened the door to discriminating against LGBTQ people in public accommodations. Book bans, drag bans, sports bans, bathroom bans, and it's a lot. Where do you find hope, and how do you communicate that hope to young people? Laura.
I'm excited for young people today. And I'm also excited for what the future of LGBTQ communities are going to look like. I can't wait to get old and to hear all the new words young people are using, the ways they identify, the fun clothes they wear. A lot more young people in this generation are identifying as part of queer and trans communities. If you look at the most recent Gallup poll, it's 21% of Gen Z. And that's compared to 10% of millennials and 4% of Gen X and even smaller percentages of other generations. I love seeing young people, they're speaking out, they're talking about things like mental health in ways that previous generations weren't. And they care about a lot of the important issues in the world, the kind of things that you were talking about. They care about racial justice. They care about taking care of our planet. And they're creating their own language around all of these types of things. And in terms of interactions with the mental health field, they're joining the field and they're making it better. And they're also finding providers who support them, and they're refusing to go to those that don't. So I kind of can't wait to see what they're going to do next.
Elon?
Oh boy, I was afraid you will ask me to say something optimistic. I agree with everything Laura said. And for me, where I find hope is that I think back to how things were and recognize, both in my own life and before that, how much things have improved. Things have improved for LGBT people in ways that were not even imaginable 100 years ago or 50 years ago. But at the same time, I'm very, very worried. When we saw a lot of the improvements, there was a certain time, maybe during Obama administration, that everything seemed to be going our way. And at that time, we started the study that looked at how younger generations of LGBT people fare in terms of, because everything has changed, everything is changing, marriage equality and all that. And we wanted to see how well they're doing, because I actually had doubt about it. So even then I was a little bit doubtful that all the positive changes that we read about and feel are actually making the impact that we think it should. And then Trump was elected and things started to roll back into attacks and, all the things you described, literally book burning, back to that. You mentioned before the attack on gay people as pedophiles, the resurrecting of old stereotypes. And so for me, I feel that there's a lot more to do. We're fighting here in California in school boards about things that really I didn't think we would have believed even 10 years ago that we would have to be fighting about. School boards want to eliminate Harvey Milk because they say he was a pedophile from books. Because here in California we have a law that requires schools to teach actually about, as it's called, the contribution of LGBT people to California's history. And even with that, we're not doing a great job. So I do have a lot of hope, and I do see all the positive things. And as Laura said, young people are energized. I think young people are more accepting. We know that compared to older people. That is all on the optimistic side. I still look every time the CDC publishes their youth survey. The first thing I look at is suicide of LGBT people, and it continues to be high. And looking at that makes me sad because I still see young LGBT people struggling, again, as Laura mentioned before, with her clients, her patients, struggling with families that are not accepting, struggling with societies that are not accepting, struggling with schools that are rejecting. So count on me to bring down this conversation to a depressing note and bring it up again.
I'm often asked where I think things are. And I feel confident with what I've said over the decades. It's now decades. Whatever the challenges, these are the best of times. Because look where we were when we were kids. And we're having this conversation. And look where you're employed, the two of you. And look what I'm getting to do by sharing these stories. I think that long after we're gone, we'll go through these cycles of progress and regression. The mistake we make is that the battle is ever over. It is a forever battle. And that is part of our jobs as long as we're here on this planet. So Dr. Laura Erickson Schroth is a psychiatrist committed to improving mental health through education and resource creation. She is the Chief Medical Officer at the JED Foundation, and Dr. Elon H. Meyer is the Williams Distinguished Senior Scholar for Public Policy at the Williams Institute and Professor Emeritus of Socio-Medical Sciences at Columbia University. Thank you both for your time and for helping bring this conversation about mental health in our communities absolutely into the present moment, and for helping us understand what's changed for the better and what we need to do so much better in the future.
Thank you so much for having us, and it's great to be.
Mind you, that episode that we just finished listening to, this particular one right here, was 10 months ago. I have one last thing before we end this live. Let me look at y'all comments real quick. Queen Stevie said, now they want to control people's personal worship or faith. We don't bow down or bend the knee to that. And that's why there is a thing called resistance. Deshaun says, they're definitely going to exterminate the queer America. Exterminate the queer. America is not the place. It never was for gay people. And sometimes it will be a trap where you can be free, whatever you want, and then once the policy changes, then they'll get you by someone else. Sizzle Moon said, true people of quality will always stand up for and with those seeking equality and practicing and exercising it too, for that matter. We just surround ourselves with allies and reject those who do not accept or support us fully. Tolerance is not love. Boy Crazy said, my take on homophobia is the fear of the association with being labeled homosexual. Heterosexuality isn't normal, just common, Dorothy Parker. Sizzle Moon says, I don't identify as trans, but have been refused care in emergency rooms and even mugged while waiting to be discharged. And security was less than helpful, allowed the person to leave with my wallets and keys. Wow. Wow. See, we ain't got to make this up. And again, since y'all talking so much about the cheering, let's check on the cheering real quick. This is courtesy of them.us, and it reads, crisis calls from LGBTQ plus youth spiked by 700% after election day. And for the people that's in the bushes watching, y'all have a lot of homework to do. Prove me wrong. I'm waiting. Queer youth are afraid, confused, and anxious about the outcome of the election in these conversations, the Trevor Project said. Here are some resources. Now, this post originally appeared on the 19th. And if you or a loved one are in a crisis, please call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255. 8255, that's 1-800-273-TALK, or contact the crisis text line by texting TALK to 741-741. When the presidential race was called for Donald Trump in the early hours of Wednesday, calls and texts to a leading queer youth suicide prevention organization exploded in a massive outpouring of anxiety over the election results. The Trevor Project saw an overall 700% increase in calls, texts, and chats compared to prior weeks. The organization offers a lifeline via phone, online chat, or text to queer youth who are struggling with thoughts of depression, self-harm, or suicide while navigating coming out to their families or facing discrimination. Right now, the services are experiencing, listen to this part. Right now, the services are experiencing long hold times at an especially vulnerable time for queer people. Queer youth are afraid, confused, and anxious about the outcome of the election in these conversations, a spokesperson from the Trevor Project said. Their crisis services usually focus on supporting the mental health of queer and trans youth from ages 13 to 24 while they navigate relationships, gender identity, and coming out. Now, the vast majority of young queer Americans are seeking emergency help due to what they described in text and chat messages to the helpline as election anxiety. These pleas for help are not happening in a vacuum. They are the result of a political environment that has brought transphobia into the political mainstream, especially from Trump's campaign. The former president's campaign spent over $20 million on ads portraying trans people as harmful to society or attacking Vice President Kamala Harris's support of trans people. Trump has pledged to enact extreme anti-queer policies in his second term, such as attempting to charge teachers with sex discrimination after affirming students' gender identities. Some of his proposals mimic state anti-queer laws that have gone in effect in the past few years. Those state laws and the vitriolic rhetoric surrounding them have been steadily eroding the mental health of queer youth. Prior research from the Trevor Project, in partnership with the polling firm Morning Consult, found that state proposals restricting the rights of queer youth in schools, sports, and doctors' offices negatively affect their mental health. New research by the Trevor Project, published in the journal Nature Human Behavior, found that state laws targeting trans people caused trans and non-binary youth to be more likely to attempt suicide within the past year. The spike in crisis services outreach is alarming, says James Black, CEO of the Trevor Project. But, Black added, the organization is not surprised that the wave of anti-queer policies of the past few years continues to harm young people's mental health. Quote, the current political environment in the U.S. is heavy, but it is so important for queer youth people, young people, to know that they do not have to shoulder this weight alone, Black said. LGBTQ plus young people, your life matters, and you were born to live it, Black added. The Trevor Project encourages queer youth to take a break from news and social media, silencing notifications when trying to relax, and finding community wherever possible, whether in person or online. Additional resources include calling the Trans Lifeline, which has specific resources and upcoming meetings for those dealing with post-election grief. Texting hotlines such as Thrive Lifeline and Steve Fund. calling the queer LGBT National Youth Talk Line, or reaching out to a counselor through the crisis text line. Another way to seek help when in crisis or contemplating suicide is by reaching out to a trusted friend, community, or family member. Lambada Legal, a queer legal group, has compiled a list of state-level resources for queer youth, including mentorship programs and community centers. To connect with new friends and discuss shared hobbies, Q-Chat Space offers an online community for queer teenagers. Parents of queer youth looking for supportive spaces can find state and local P-Flag chapters across the country or join virtual meetings. I believe the one thing that this experience is teaching all of us in reference to humanity, but, you know, keeping it here as far as queer, is that queer people, we have to start finding ways to really love ourselves. The reason why we have to fucking keep fighting is because of a bunch of other insecure motherfuckers with power and resources who want to demonize us in order to make themselves feel connected to God. And this election has proven that they don't want queer people a part of this experience. They don't want black people a part of this experience. They don't want women walking in their truth and their power and their independence to be a part of this system. They don't. And now they have allowed this country in all forms of government to be on one accord to once again show what they deem to be their only way of connecting to God, which is showing God's wrath. But the gag is that wrath is not just coming for queer people. It's not just coming for black people. It's not just coming for women. What the fuck we're about to experience is a pushback on love and humanity. This is the beginning of a new world order, and that's what they've been telling us in our face for the longest time, and now they have been successful of setting up the stage, girl, for that to happen. And the only way that is going to fully manifest in the way that they want to is if we continue to operate in the one thing that really gives them power, which is fear. And I encourage all people of humanity to start loving yourself, and whatever individual traumatic shit you have going on in your life, it's time for you to learn from that shit, heal from that shit, transcend that shit, because what's to come? Oh, baby. And I'm gonna show you exactly what that is. But before I do that, please make sure you hit that like button, because it helps this channel to grow in the algorithms. We have now went from 820 to 822. Shout out to the new subbies. If you like the vibe over here on BubzDaGawd, and us facing fear, having the real difficult conversations for real, with the context and the nuance, including what is going to happen to us, Make sure you hit that subscribe button as well as that notification bell so that you can stay up to date with my edited and live content, okay? If there's anything in this live that touched and agreed with your spirit and you want to share it in other spaces to generate conversation, to inspire other queer people, I ask that you please do so by screen recording it or sharing my live on your platforms, and just make sure to tag me in them. I am BubzDaGawd any and everywhere. And speaking of BubzDaGawd, if you feel compelled, and only if you feel compelled, you can definitely hit me up in the Cash App, $BubzDaGawd, because y'all, I'm doing the scary work. The work that will unfortunately and eventually put a target on my back. So to kind of ease the pain a little bit, you can definitely hit a nigga up in the Cash App, $BubzDaGawd. Shout out to Queen Stevie. Shout out to King Deshaun. Shout out to Sizzle Moon Song. Shout out to you and thank you for the new sub. Shout out to Boy Crazy. Shout out to, I always mess this up, Rajan, forgive me. Please forgive me, I will get it one day. Shout out to you. Shout out to Queen Amber. Shout out to Asia. Shout out to my bro Aaron Wilds Out. Shout out to Queen Spicy. Shout out to everybody in the bushes. Shout out to the replay gang. And until next time, everybody, y'all stay vigilant. Y'all stay aware. Y'all stay safe. And most importantly, y'all stay prayed and strapped the fuck up. You have a right to be here. If motherfuckers want to believe what they want to believe about queer people, that's their prerogative. But when they overstep their boundaries from verbal to physical and put their motherfucking hands on you, you have divinely appointed by the Creator to protect yourself. Because if God really had a problem with your ass, God ain't got no issue getting rid of your ass, because it's God. So when these other motherfuckers decide to speak for God and for you, we all going to the motherfucking king. We all gonna talk to his ass personally and get its real response. Until next time, everybody. Peace.
Pleased to meet you. Pleased to have you on my plate. Your meat is sweet to me. Your destiny, your fate. You're my life support. Your life is my sport. I'm a man eating machine. I'm a man eating machine. You won't hear me laughing as I terminate your day. You can't trace my footsteps as I walk the other way. I can't get enough prey. Eating pray for me. I can't get enough prey. A man eating pray for me. Corporate cannibal, digital criminal. consume my consumers with no sense of humor. I'll give you uniform chloroform, sanitize, homogenize, vaporize you. I'm the spark. Make the world explode. I'll make the world explode. Digital
I can be anything I choose in this round. We are a sound vibration too deep to tell.